Orders of the day.
Taxation cross-border trade bill not amended in the Public Bill Committee to be considered.
We will begin with new clause 1, with which it will be convenient to debate the other new clauses and amendments as set out on the order paper. And I call Anna Soubry to move new clause 1.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I rise in support of new clause 1 and new clause 12. And I also seek very briefly to speak against new clauses 36 and new clause 73. And I hope that there will be a division, and in the event of that division, I will vote against new clause 36 and new clause 73. It is my firm view that it is deeply regrettable that this government has accepted those amendments, even though they clearly seek to undermine, if not wreck, the great advances that have been made in this white paper. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will speak, as I like to think I always do, with openness, frankness and with honesty. So I'm slightly concerned about the fact that when I became a business minister in 2015 in David Cameron's government, I'd be the first to admit that I did not know the finer details of how so many of our manufacturing industries and businesses actually worked. I knew about supply chains, I knew the value of them, but I couldn't claim to be in any way, shape or form particularly familiar with them. But relishing my brief, I was soon enmeshed in the manufacturing sector in particular, and I had responsibility, for example, for the automotive sector, aerospace, all manner, and of course the steel industry, which many honourable and right honourable members will remember that particularly difficult time. I soon became quite not an expert, but I certainly knew my brief, and I certainly understood how supply chains worked, and the value of this thing called frictionless trade, and this thing called just-in-time, what that really was all about. But I'd never actually seen it until Friday, when on Friday I went to the Toyota factory at Burnston, just outside Derby. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would make it compulsory for every single member of this House to go to Toyota. Well, they can go to another car manufacturer in Swindon, by way of example, or go to Nissan in Sunderland, as I went to shortly after the EU referendum, and actually begin and understand what a supply chain is, why it relies on frictionless borders, and what just-in-time means. Let me just give you a little bit of history about that remarkable place in Toyota just outside of Derby. It's actually a legacy to Margaret Thatcher. It was begun and opened at the beginning of the 1990s. And some of us are actually old enough to remember those times and to remember what had happened in a lot of our traditional manufacturing industries. My right honourable friend, the member for Loughborough, sits just alongside me. She has a business in her constituency called Brush, long-standing business in Loughborough, that has for generations provided good quality jobs for people. I had Siemens in my constituency, and at one time I had a number of miners who worked in local pits in North Nottinghamshire and some of them in Derbyshire. And in due course, certainly the pits closed and Siemens closed. Now, when we talk about Brexit, people extrapolate all sorts of things from the vote. One of the things that definitely occurred, and I know it occurred for people in my constituency, a number of people voted leave because they felt left behind by what we call now this global world and this global way of doing business. These are the left behinds. These are people who used to work, often down the pits in Nottinghamshire. I'm from Worksop, so I know what people are, the sort of lives that miners went through, and I have no romantic attachment for people who work for the coal mining industry, I can tell you. But like those who worked in factories like Siemens, these were high-quality jobs. They invariably paid good money, but they also added even more value. It wasn't just about the fact that it was work, which is in itself the right thing to do. It wasn't just the wages, which in the deep coal mines of Nottinghamshire were very good, and at Siemens. It wasn't just the trade and the skills that they conveyed. It was also that feeling of community and being valued. All those great traditional British manufacturing values, which began to disappear, in truth, through the 80s and into the 90s. And what the great Japanese car manufacturers brought back was much of that high-valued, highly skilled, super effective, super efficient manufacturing industry. It's not just confined to automotive sector, it's the many other sectors. It runs right across the manufacturing side of our economy, which makes up 20% of our economy. And I want just to say to all honourable and right honourable members on this side of the House, shame on you if you have a manufacturer in your constituency that you've not been to see and understand how a modern manufacturing business works with that need for frictionless trade for those supply chains to work. And shame on you if you've not taken the opportunity to go to those places that might be out with your constituency, but where your constituents work. And I say that very gently. For example, to my honourable friend, in a moment, I will take the honourable gentleman's intervention, but not yet. The honourable gentleman, for example, for Mansfield, many of whom of his constituents work in exactly these same sorts of manufacturing industries that I am describing, and no doubt, like some of my constituents, will work at Toyota. And when you go and you see how these wonderful manufacturing businesses work, whether it's ceramics, cars, automotive, whether it's potteries or whether it's in glass, what you will see and understand is the importance of frictionless trade. And what it means in the real world is that at Burnaston, parts arrive, and within 3 hours of arriving at that factory in lorries that have come up through the tunnel, straight up the motorway system, arriving at Toyota, within 3 hours, they are on the assembly line. It is an astonishing, incredible achievement which this country should be proud of. And it is part of Margaret Thatcher's legacy, because it was Margaret... One moment, and I will take your intervention. One moment. It was Margaret, my right honourable friend's intervention, not yours, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was Margaret Thatcher that championed free trade as a proud Conservative. And I'm a Tory. I believe in business. I believe in capitalism. I believe in enterprise. I believe in our economy. It provides jobs. It provides prosperity. It is indeed an engine of aspiration for so many of my constituents who do want to see themselves going into apprenticeships at Rolls-Royce as much as they would like to go to the finest universities. And I'll take the honourable gentleman's intervention.
I knew Margaret Thatcher. I worked for Margaret Thatcher. My honourable friend ain't no Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, pathetic. Is that the best you can do?
Good addition to the debate.
Can I say to my right honourable friend, I don't pretend to be
Quite right.
able to walk in Margaret Thatcher's boots, but I have read her speeches about the advantages of the single market. Yeah. She was a huge champion. She was probably the biggest champion of the single market, and it was Margaret Thatcher that went over to Japan and promised the Japanese that our country would always stay in the single market. And on that basis, Japanese business invested in this country billions of pounds. And I'd say to my right honourable and friend, when he attacks me in that wholly unnecessary, really rather foolish way, I would say this to him. I hope that he will speak in our debate freely and honestly, and give his assessment of what is facing our country if we don't get Brexit right. Because it's all well and good having your ideologically driven, hard Brexit ideas and unable to face up to the reality of what it means for people in my constituency and in the rest of our country. In a moment. And this is the reality as faced in this white paper. If we do not deliver frictionless trade in the way that companies like Toyota need and demand, they will simply not be able to operate. 81% of their trade, of the cars produced in Burnaston, are exported into the European Union. And before anybody says, well, there will be new markets, you know, the unicorns that our government will be chasing in new deals, please understand how modern manufacturing industry works. Great companies like Toyota already make cars in other parts of the world to satisfy and to supply them to the local market. And I'll give way to my right honourable friend, then I'll come down the road.
Can I thank my right honourable friend very much indeed for giving way? Doesn't the intervention that she's just received from our colleague on these benches show what is the matter with this Brexit debate? Rather than talking about the detail and the risks to thousands of jobs across the country in our manufacturing sector, a sector which we as a party have championed since 2010, he prefers to trade insults and trade on personalities.
Here's a surprise. I completely agree with my right honourable friend. I'll take note down the road first in a moment, gents. Hang on.
My right honourable friend, forgive me, I've been listening with great interest to her speech as a former Remainer and fellow believer in free enterprise. That's why I set out a plan as to how we can have frictionless trade using the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement that was entered into in 2017, a detailed plan. But my constituents have a question which I'd like to pose to her. Why is it so many lorries come in through Dover laden with goods and so many return empty? Why is there a £100 billion trade surplus for the European Union? And why do we give them access to our goods market but not insist on access to our financial services market after we leave the European Union?
I don't wish to be rude to my honourable friend, but that really is the stuff of madness. Of course we need to export more, but the real question he should be asking is this. At the moment, a lorry that comes in from the European Union through Dover will take, at the most, 2 minutes to go through. If it comes from outside the European Union, at the least, it takes 20 minutes, and at the most, and more typically, 2 hours. So how does that transpose now to the manufacturing sector and to those workers in Toyota outside Derby? 3,000 people, 3 to 5 times as many in the supply chain. I say to my honourable friend, this, sir, is the real world. And in the real world, at Toyota, they make an order for car seats to be delivered absolutely ready onto that production line within 4 hours of it being made. And if we do not deliver frictionless trade, either by a customs union or indeed by some magical third way that the Prime Minister thinks she can deliver on, and good luck to her on that, if we do not do that, thousands of jobs will go. And honourable members sitting on these benches in private conversations know that to be the case. And what they have said in those private conversations is the loss of hundreds of thousands of jobs will be worth it to regain our country's sovereignty. You tell that to the people of my constituency. You tell that to the people who voted leave in my constituency. Nobody voted to be poorer, and nobody voted leave on the basis that somebody with a gold-plated pension and inherited wealth would take their job away from them.
Can I tell my right honourable friend that I have a very successful manufacturer in my constituency abiding by the very disciplines that she's been so rightly effusive about. Imagine then my surprise when I discovered that the proprietor and chief executive of this organisation, Coltec, one Mike Bailey, imagine my surprise when I discovered that he was to be my opponent as the UKIP candidate in the New Forest West division.
I'll take this intervention.
I think the point that my right honourable friend didn't want to take is there are plenty of businessmen that are in favour of leaving the European Union. But the point I wanted to raise with my right honourable friend is that her whole argument is passionately based on the fallacy that you cannot have just-in-time supply chains crossing international customs frontiers. But that's the way most of the rest of the world trades. In fact, Toyota in her own constituency, and I met them last week, quite a substantial of their, proportion of their componentry arrives from outside the European Union to be bolted to those cars. So that is the point. She is putting up these completely false fears that just-in-time supply chains are somehow threatened by trading across customs frontiers.
To my right honourable friend, that is absolute codswallop. Because when I went to Toyota, they absolutely showed us exactly the places where they come from. So there are some parts, by way of example, that come from Japan. And what was done was a special arrangement with Japan, so that they come into the factory and they sit in a special arrangement of a bonded warehouse. That number of parts is less than 1%. They have 2.5 million parts coming into that factory. The vast majority come from the European Union. They rely on frictionless trade. And with great respect to my honourable friend, this is somebody who makes the case for WTO, that we should be a member of the World Trade Organization. Let's just get this one straight. If our country joins the World Trade Organization, unless, of course, we are as a member of the European Union, we are a member through our membership of the European Union, so if we're a member in our own right of the World Trade Organization, we have to abide by their rules. And their rules say that every member must secure their borders. They must secure their borders. That doesn't just mean to say that our country, when we leave the European, must secure our borders. The European Union, whether they like it or not, must secure their borders. And what does that mean? You will have to have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And it is dishonest and disingenuous for people to stand up and make out that something other than that is the reality. This white paper faces up to Brexit reality, and that is what honourable and right honourable members on this side of the House now must do. We have to face the reality, just like I have had to face the reality that we are leaving the European Union. Honourable members here have to do the right thing by their constituents and put trade and business at the heart of Brexit. I will quickly give way.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way and just go back to the point about enforcing our border, because some people say if we were trading on WTO rules, we would not need to have a border in Ireland. But under the WTO's most favoured nations rules, if we did not enforce the border in Ireland, we would be in breach of our agreements with other parts of the world. We have no right to say no border. And furthermore, if Ireland did not enforce the border with the rest of the UK, they would be in breach with the EU. And if the EU did not require Ireland to respect the border, then they would be in breach of their obligations across the world. So thank you for making this point so clear.
Very long but very good intervention. I'll quickly go over the other side.
Royal Lady for giving way, and I've heard exactly the same points made to me by businesses in my community and indeed about the Northern Ireland border. It's why I favour staying in a customs union. But can she explain to me, I think the white paper is full of magical thinking, but can she explain to me the amendments that have been put down by some in her party today actually directly contradict what is in the white paper, because what they really want, of course, is a no-deal Brexit. They want reckless no-deal Brexit, crash out with all the damage that would cause. Is that what she feels?
I completely agree. Completely agree with the honourable gentleman. And I say to my government, this government is in grave danger of not just losing the plot, but losing a considerable amount of support from the people of this country unless we get Brexit right. To accept these amendments, notably new clause 36 and new clause 73. These amendments were not tabled by the people who put their names to them to be helpful to the government and to this white paper. We know that because of their public proclamations when they have tried to trash this white paper. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't seek, and I made it clear to the whips and, well, actually, to the Minister. I have a lot of time for the Minister. I think he's a very good minister, and he's a very good man. He's a very good constituency MP as well, if I may. I say that because I've been to his constituency. But in any event...
That's your career over now.
That was, the record needs to record. That was said by my honourable friend, the member for Huntingdon. If anybody else had said it, I would have been very, very, very rude.
No, it was...
Oh, no, it wasn't. Sorry. Scrub that out. Want it. Ever the troublemaker. This is really serious, though. And it is serious. I told the Minister I would not be pushing these amendments to a vote. Not because I lack courage. In fact, given events, I'd like to think I've got a bit of courage. In fact, some say I actually don't have a fear gene at all. And just to remind honourable members, 3 people have received custodial sentences for the death threats that I have had. Yeah. And I'm getting a bit tired of being called a traitor and being accused of traitor. And there are certain people sitting on these benches who actually support a newspaper that had the disgraceful temerity to suggest that the Prime Minister of our country might in some way have committed treason by the production of this paper. It is outrageous, and the right honourable and honourable members on these benches nearly need to have a bit of a reality check, not just on Brexit, but on the way that this party is conducting itself and who they choose to call their friends. Yeah. But I'm going to return to this, why I'm not pushing these to a vote.
Order, just before the Honourable Lady returns to the substance of her remarks, I would just point out to her that she has already had 21 minutes of the debate, and that although I appreciate order, it's not a music hall. Not coming back to it. And the Honourable Lady is perfectly in order. She has a lot of things to deal with, and she's taken a lot of interventions, but I know that she will quite soon begin to come to a peroration. Anna Soubry.
By a remarkable coincidence, Madam Deputy Speaker, I am coming to the conclusion of my remarks, because I want to explain why I'm not pushing these amendments to a vote, as I indicated to the Minister last week. And the reason for that is because of the production of this white paper. Now, I'd be very frank. This white paper doesn't go as far as I think it should go. It is silent on services, particularly, really, which make up 80% of our economy. But the reason I have given it the welcome that I have, because I believe that it absolutely marks the fact that our Prime Minister understands the needs of British business, manufacturing in particular, and she is determined to do the right thing. She's come up with this third way. Whether she can achieve it remains to be seen. But it was because of my support for this white paper to give this third way a chance that I decided not to push these matters to a vote. So you can imagine, Madam Deputy Speaker, having done that, believing, as I am, as a pragmatic, reasonable, moderate Conservative, that I was doing the right thing by my country as much as anything else, and by my Prime Minister. My profound disappointment that today this government, for reasons which I can just about understand, has decided not just to accept 4 amendments, 2 of which are particularly not controversial, but 36 and 73 are wrecking amendments. They seek to wreck and undermine this, and I'll quickly give way.
Well, I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend, because isn't one of the features of these 2 amendments that, in fact, they don't do what the proposers seek from it? So the fact that the government has chosen to accept amendments that are unnecessary, useless, shows that the only intention behind their tabling was malevolent, and the fact that they are being maintained at the present time is also an act of malevolence towards the government by the proposers of it.
Yep. I'm afraid to say I completely agree with my right honourable and learned friend. And members on the front bench, and in fact across this place, should be shaking their heads with shame. This is the stuff of complete madness. And the only reason that the government has accepted these amendments is because it's frightened of somewhere in the region of 40 members of Parliament, the hard no-deal Brexiteers, who should have been seen off a long time ago and should be seen off again. Because these are people who do not want a responsible Brexit. They want their version of Brexit. And they don't even represent the people who actually voted leave. And the consequences of this are grave, not just for our country, but also for this party. And one has to wonder now, who is in charge? Who's running Britain? Is it the Prime Minister, or is it the Honourable Member for North East Somerset? I know where my money's sitting at the moment. Give way.
Isn't it the truth that what's really been going on here is that some individuals, some of these extreme individuals, have in fact been threatening, trying to hold the government hostage, saying they're going to vote against third reading, bring the government down in order to get these bizarre, contradictory amendments through?
Absolutely right. That is what has happened. And it is so disgraceful because this white paper is a genuine attempt by our Prime Minister to heal the divisions in our party and indeed the divisions in our country and take us to a smooth and sensible Brexit that delivers for everybody in our country. I'll quickly give way, and that will be my last intervention.
Quickly. Would my honourable friend agree, the right honourable friend agree, that if the government was guaranteed the support of the Labour Party and the Scottish Nationalists against these wrecking amendments, we could finally reveal what a tiny minority of the House of Commons as a whole are trying to hold us all to ransom about a reasonable deal with the European Union?
My right honourable and learned friend is as right as ever. Madam Deputy Speaker, the truth of it is that both political parties, main political parties, are now in the grasp of the few who falsely claim to speak for the many. A lack of ability, or perhaps courage, the overliking of the safety and the sanctity of ministerial office, or just frankly a quiet life on whatever side of this House, a guaranteed income by a loyal backbencher with a handsome majority, that means that our country is not just hurtling to the extremes of British political life, but equally over the Brexit cliff, which the overwhelming majority of Leavers didn't vote for. Indeed, they were promised the precise opposite. The time has come for the nonsense to be stopped. The time has come for people to show courage and do the right thing by our country. We're leaving the European Union, but we've got to leave in such a way that protects the jobs and the prosperity and peace in Northern Ireland for everybody in this country. And it's time for people to put aside the ideology and the nonsenses, invariably that come from not inhabiting the real world. Face up to the reality, as this white paper seeks to do. Reject these two ludicrous amendments that the government have agreed to, and in due course let's wake up to the further reality. We'll end up in the single market and the customs union. The only question is when.
Clause 1, EU customs union and pre-commencement requirements.
The question is that new Clause 1 be read the second time. Chris Leslie.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I commend the passion in the speech from the Right Honourable Member for Broxtowe, who spoke authentically about the care and attention that she's taken to look into the supply chain issues, the just-in-time delivery systems that are the foundations of our modern manufacturing industry in this country. Not taking an ideological view, which certain members opposite who may be guffawing at this might take, but thinking about the economy, the jobs of our constituents, and all of the prosperity and the tax revenues that pay for the vital public services that we need to keep this country going, the National Health Service, the education system, housing, local government. All of these things depend on a healthy, vibrant economy. And if we go down the avenue suggested by some of the hard Brexiteers on the benches opposite, then not only will we jeopardise the jobs in those industries, but we face a decade or more of austerity to come, because the Treasury's own analysis has been revealed and shows that a big black hole emerges in Treasury tax revenues if we leave the customs union and the single market, which, to my point of view, are the absolute minimum
where we need to be in this country. Now, the amendments that we have before us today cover a number of different issues, but I think the Honourable Member for Broxtowe touched upon some of the wrecking amendments that have been tabled by the European Reform Group, the members of the hard Brexit crew on the benches opposite. I think she's probably right, there are about 40 of them, and it would be a terrible shame if the Prime Minister, rather than looking at where the equilibrium, the balance of opinion rests within Parliament, which I do not think is for a hard Brexit, were to somehow be hijacked and her agenda taken over by that Trumpian hard Brexit view. And those amendments on the order paper today, particularly New Clause 36, which is clearly a wrecking amendment to her the notion of a facilitated customs arrangement that she put in the Chequers Agreement, are designed to make sure that the Chequers plan only ever lasted for 1 week. Well, I have my issues with the Chequers plan. I think it falls short of that de minimis, that customs union, EEA single market. But in particular, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to draw your attention to Amendment 73, which actually goes way beyond the Chequers arrangement. It says that if Britain were to ever enter into any future customs unions with whatever territories that would be, we wouldn't be able to have the smooth VAT acquisition arrangements that we currently have, where we avoid firms having to pay up front at the border value-added tax, and we get rid of that arrangement. We have frictionless trade because VAT is such an important part of that. If amendments, and I hope my front bench also are listening to this point as well as members opposite, because Amendment 73 from the ERG is a wrecking amendment that would hurt our economy regardless of the Chequers plan. It goes beyond that. It talks about undermining our customs arrangements more broadly. So I would implore my front bench that when we look at that issue this evening, even if the government want to accept that, we should be opposing Amendment 73 in particular. Yes, I'll give way.
I think the honourable gentleman misunderstands Amendment 73. One of the other amendments, which the government has also accepted, stops the government having a Henry VIII power for a new customs union. If a new customs union were to be brought in by legislation, Amendment 73 could be brought in under that customs arrangement, and it simply retains power for this House.
I think we've got the measure of the honourable gentleman now. He used to be quite an entertaining curiosity in this place. No longer. He represents a major present threat to the future of our economy and the jobs of our constituents. And what he is trying to do here, he is trying to scupper and find ways of wrecking the smooth, frictionless arrangements that we have for businesses that currently have to pay VAT, but can do so because we treat VAT as a matter of dispatches and arrivals, rather than having to have it paid up front. And by deleting that part of Schedule 8 from the bill, he would be putting a hole below the waterline of a future VAT arrangement. So I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Isn't what we're seeing here an insertion of further red lines at a time where we really have enough of them already?
Well said. Yes, exactly. And it would be, I think, very sensible for the government to read the room, to start thinking about where is there a consensus in Parliament to get a positive way forward, rather than constantly laying down or accepting more red lines or caving in to threats from a few very loud but a very tiny minority viewpoint in this particular country. I think it's really important. That's why I moved New Clause 2, Madam Deputy Speaker, which would preserve the role that we currently have, our participation in the EU VAT area. I do hope that many honourable members will see the purpose of that, because currently I think we have 25 million customs declarations paying VAT at the border currently. This is going to rise potentially to 255 million. And imagine the bureaucracy, the costs, the administration, the paperwork in our VAT system if those also have to be made at the border. If we end up with Amendment 73, taking out that, I think maybe I was raising this issue actually as a matter of debate, but maybe I should press New Clause 2 to a vote. EU VAT area is absolutely crucial in the way that we need to avoid a frictionless, hard border. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important that we do pick out some of the problems with the Chequers arrangement, and I understand the Prime Minister's trying to sort of find some sort of balance here, but I'm afraid to say the notion of a facilitated customs arrangement just doesn't quite get to where we need to do. I'm delighted that there was an acceptance of how important a common rule book for goods is to our country. That is an important recognition of economic reality. But it is only one piece of the jigsaw that we need in order to make sure, for instance, that the 80% of our economy in the services sector isn't completely abandoned and we lose out as a result. Yes, of course, I'll give way.
I appreciate the honourable member for giving way. I'd just like to reflect on how refreshing it is, and actually probably what the majority of this country wants to see, which is sensible people working cross-party trying to find a way forward in this dreadful mess. I agree with the honourable member that perhaps the Chequers is an opening bid, isn't it, to the EU, saying, OK, come back and tell us which pieces you're happy or unhappy with. I'm interested if he knows Labour's position on the wrecking amendments, 73 and 36 specifically, and will he and his party be joining us by voting against them?
Well, I'll certainly be wanting to vote against Amendment 73, but my honourable friends will make their remarks in their own time. I don't know what their intentions yet. I haven't had a chance to hear from them. But I think intuitively, my honourable friends, looking and knowing what the honourable member for North Somerset's up to, knowing where they come from on the political spectrum, the hard right Brexit perspective, and knowing how important the economy is to the future of this country, I doubt very much that they will abstain on Amendment 73. I'll give way.
And it's also very clear, indeed, as Morgan says, who they're working with and what their actual agenda is. They're working with the likes of Nigel Farage and others outside who would like to see us crash out so they can deregulate the economy and become this kind of, Singapore tax haven on the edge of Europe where they can pursue their right-wing fantasies.
Yes, indeed. I think it would be helpful if we also view the two bills that we have today and tomorrow as a piece, because they do interrelate with one another. Many of the amendments down tomorrow in relation to the customs union are also down on the order paper today. And I do say gently to the government, nice try with your facilitated customs arrangement, but it's not going to fly for a number of different reasons. I do urge the Chancellor and the Minister, stop putting down red lines that you will only find come back and embarrass you in future when you will have to accept a customs union. And let me just quickly go into the detail of why a customs union really will have to apply in this situation. Because the facilitated customs, and there might be actually honourable members obviously who agree with me on this, that the facilitated customs arrangement may well apply if we have free trade agreements, with the EU. But it's only a customs union that gets rid of what's known as the rules of origin requirements that we have, this sense of local content thresholds that you need to prove if an FTA is in place in order to qualify for preferential tariff arrangements. Under a customs union, you don't have to have that rules of origin checks. That is a massive advantage to the customs union. I'll give way. Yeah.
I mean, it is actually not actually correct. It's quite common in a free trade agreement to have what is known as an auto-pact, so that there can be frictionless arrangements for something like the motor industry. The same could apply for aerospace.
There are certain manufactured goods where they have that, but across the piece of a whole economy, you don't see a circumstance where rules of origin have been abolished in the way that he's talking about. And rules of origin are really quite burdensome to prove for a manufacturer. I'll give way in a moment, because manufacturers have to show, they have to count the content, where those components come from, they have to document that, they then have to lodge those documents as they cross the border. My point is the facilitated customs arrangement, with its rules of origin requirements, will have friction at that border. And for that reason, we're going to have to accept that a customs union is preferable. Very quickly.
I'd like to thank the member for giving way and suggest that on this issue of rules of origin, he may wish to read the Pan-European Mediterranean legislation on rules of origin, which covers a broader area than just the customs union. It is possible to have agreement of rules of origin outside the customs union.
Well, I have very different experience in terms of the information that I have. I think if you look across that range of goods as a whole, there are problems outside the customs union with rules of origin. The second problem with the facilitated customs arrangement, though, is that it breaches Article 3 of GATT. As part of the World Trade Organization rules. Article 3 is the national treatment principle, which says that you shouldn't really treat imported goods unfairly relative to domestically produced goods. And because of the track and trace requirements in the facilitated customs arrangement architecture, you're going to have to treat imported goods differently from those produced and made in the UK. The third point, because I'm conscious other members want to come in, is that if we want to make free trade agreements with the rest of the world, the government are shooting themselves in the foot with the facilitated customs arrangement, because GATT Article 24 says that you have to eliminate substantially all trade barriers between constituent trade authorities. So if the UK is having to collect tariffs on behalf of the EU, it is introducing a barrier that is going to fetter future trade FTAs. Not that I particularly believe that we can get better FTAs beyond the customs union. I think our leverage as part of the EU is superior. But on a technical level, the facilitated customs arrangement, I'm afraid to say, just isn't going to wash. Yes.
Will my honourable friend give way? On the important issue of rules of origin that he's just raised, if the argument we've heard from some people is it's not a problem, if it is not a problem, then why has the government in paragraph 23 of the white paper said that the UK is proposing, quote, no routine requirements for rules of origin between the UK and the EU?
Well, exactly. This is the sort of thing it thinks presumably it can negotiate between the UK and the EU bilaterally. Actually, that's not the way this works. In the World Trade Organization arrangements, you have to make sure that you have the same application of rules as you would in other arrangements around the world. I want to say not just that a customs union is preferable, but that it is the only realistic option. The idea that the European Union are going to say, fine, we're happy with you splitting the 4 freedoms that exist, is for the birds. It's not going to happen, especially as populism is running riot worldwide, and they feel very firmly that they want to defend the international rules-based system. And they feel very firmly that the European Union, that the 4 freedoms of the single market and the customs union are integral to that. And the idea that that Switzerland provides some sort of example, which has endured decades of constant treaty negotiations, year after year after year, that is not a model that Britain should be seeking a parallel in. The idea also that we should simply hope that by focusing on the withdrawal agreement we can secure our future is also, I think, a fallacy. The notion that we're going to be able to just staple onto the back of this arrangement a few sides of A4 of political statement about our future relationship with the EU is deeply dangerous. We have to make sure that we settle these issues, and I know the former BrExit Secretary agrees on this particular point. The idea that what is said on one side of exit day will necessarily be enforced on the other side of exit day is just not true. There is no legal enforceability to any warm words that are put down in terms of our future relationship. These issues have to be set out at this particular stage. Yes, I think
I'm very grateful for him giving way. Doesn't he agree that it is time that we are actually listening to the people who are running businesses rather than sitting in our comfortable seats and telling people what to do? Does he agree?
Yes, and I think the problem we've had is that ideology and populism has been running this country for the last few years, and we need to stop that, and we need to assert common sense economic reality much more. As the Honourable Member for Broxtowe was saying in her speech, I think this transcends the political parties. I do not think this is a time to be playing party political games of advantage. Our country is absolutely at stake here, and I'm afraid to say to the government it's only a matter of time before the EU, probably quite politely, say, nice try with your facilitated customs arrangement, nice try with Chequers, but you're going to have to recognise reality, which are the building blocks that that exists for all of their partnerships and arrangements with the rest of the European Union. To my mind, that means the customs union, it means the EEA, potentially EFTA, it means the single market, and I think that it would be a truly backward step for, in any way, us to undermine the ability of the UK to participate in a customs union. So we need these VAT rules to be put in place and to be continued. And I also hope that my front bench will see, certainly tomorrow, the opportunity to secure support for a customs union which is growing by the hour in this House.
Order. It will be obvious to the House that a great many people want to speak, and although we have 3 hours of debate left, we cannot continue with speeches of the length that we have had so far, though there's nothing wrong with what any honourable members have done. We will therefore start with a time limit of 12 minutes. David Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For the convenience of the members in the gallery, I should start by saying this is not a resignation statement. That was last week. This week is a return to my normal business as an ordinary backbencher, carrying out the scrutiny of business. I thought it'd be rather mundane until I walked into what appears to be this rhetorical firefight we've had so far in the debate. But before I come back to that, the Taxation Cross-Border Trade Bill and its partner, the trade bill coming tomorrow, are vital pieces of legislation. In the newspapers of the weekend, I read that some people were so cross with the white paper that they were proposing to vote against this. Well, I don't think they can be much more cross than me with the white paper, but I do urge them not to vote against it. These are vital pieces of legislation, and they are necessary, whether we have the government's white paper policy, my old white paper policy, the FTA that some have talked about, or indeed even the World Trade Organization outcome. In every single case, we need these bills, and therefore I will be supporting them. Now, I want to speak, however, directly to the new clause proposed by my right honourable friend, the member for Broxbourne. I will do so without impugning anybody's motives, questioning whether somebody is interested in the national interest or not, and I will not be firing any jibes off. I'm not quite sure who she was referring to when she talked about having an excessive attachment to public office, but I don't think it was me. The simple truth is that this is a vitally important argument. It is central to the whole question of the economic aspects of Brexit. Brexit's not just economic, it's democratic as well, but it's central to that. And I will put to one side in my arguments the fact that being out of the customs union was actually in the Conservative Party's manifesto, and therefore one which in theory at least we are committed to. Now, the arguments go right to the heart of the principal issues. The proponents of the new clauses, they have a clear belief in the national economic interest, but they clearly believe that being outside the customs union will lead to a precipitate loss of trade, and believe that the loss of ability to make trade deals matters less than that potential loss of trade. That's the core of the argument. It is pretty straightforward in that respect. Now let's look at some facts. Back in 1999, the United Kingdom, in goods, because we're talking about customs union, so goods, was exporting 60% of its goods to the European Union, 40% to the rest of the world. Since then, that's gone down by approximately 1% per annum, so now it's about 45% to the European Union and the rest to the rest of the world. Pretty much by the end of this decade, it's likely to be 60-40 in favour of the rest of the world. So the prospect of staying inside the customs union, because it takes away the right to your own commercial policy, the prospect of staying inside is favouring the shrinking minority of our trade over the expanding, fast-growing majority of expanding majority of our trade. And that's a very simple, fundamental, initial point we should take on board. It also presumes that being outside the customs union... In 1 second I will, yes, let's finish the sentence. It also presumes that being outside the customs union will significantly damage trade because there will be friction at the border. I give way to my right friend.
I'm very grateful, my right friend. One of the most remarkable features of the last 20 years has been the globalised economy and the very rapid growth and emergence of major new emerging markets. So inevitably, the balance of our trade was going to grow with them and decline with the European Union. But it's no way to... We want to remain as attractive to investors from the new economies as the old. It does us no advantage in our dealings with China, Brazil, India to damage the value of our access to the European market. It's outside events that have altered this balance. It's not a failing of our EU arrangement.
My honourable friend was being uncharacteristically inattentive, because that's exactly what I said. Because of the growth in world trade, that's what's going on. And he's exactly right that the fast growth in world trade is one which we should take a great interest in ourselves, because we are best placed probably in most countries in the world to take the most advantage of that. But also within his comment was a presumption, which I was about to address, that the friction on our trade with the European Union will cause enormous damage. Low friction, but friction will cause enormous damage. Let me get... I'll give way for once. I'll have to constrain this because of the time limit, but I'll give way once more.
I'm very grateful for my right honourable friend. Would he confirm that there are many successful manufacturing businesses in Britain today who have these just-in-time supply chains, bringing in large quantities of raw material and component from outside the EU through a system of authorised economic operators, electronic manifests and settlement of any bills not at the port? There aren't people sitting in boxes in the port taking the money.
My right honourable friend is exactly right. It's an issue I'll return to in a second. But before I do, I just want to make a point about this friction. The presumption in all of this is that we have a magical, frictionless system at the moment. Well, actually, we'll have seen on our television screens that that is not true, because this entire House will have watched Operation Stack in progress during the course of various years in the past. Operation Stack is what we do when one of the ports gets locked up for one reason or another, a strike in France or whatever. Operation Stack has been operated 74 times in 20 years. In 2015, it took about 31 days of friction. So, and our businesses, the just-in-time businesses, the perishable goods businesses, all coped with it. So let's not frighten ourselves when doing this negotiation. Let's not frighten ourselves. Nobody wants it. Nobody likes that, but they cope with it. That brings me to the point that my honourable friend... in fact, the honourable gentleman for Dover pointed out, of course, that with World Trade Organisation facilitation, we will actually minimise the friction on trade through these ports, as indeed was reinforced by my right honourable friend who spoke just now. Now, secondly, while people understandably focus on some of the pressure points in this, most particularly Dover, which we heard about a second ago, they forget that there is strong competition between the ports in the North Sea and the ports on the Channel. Zeebrugge and Antwerp and Rotterdam all want to increase their throughput at the cost of the Calais-Dover crossing. So when we are outside the European Union, they are already preparing for increases in throughput in their own areas and preparing for the increase in work, because there will be some increase in work. But again, as my honourable friend says, that won't happen at the border. It'll happen before they get there, or it'll happen after they pass through it. So our so-called dependency on French ports will turn out to be illusory. Thirdly, in support of the argument that say any friction at the border is unacceptable, we hear lots of talk about supply chains. We had it from my right honourable friend who proposed this clause. The simple truth is that they ignore the fact, as was pointed out by the Honourable Member for Harwich, I think, they ignore the fact that lots of international supply chain operations operate across borders where there are customs, tariff, currency arrangements. And I happen to know one of them very well, because I operated a business across just such a border myself, between Canada and the USA. Through the most difficult, and I went back last year to indeed respond. No, I'm not going to give away now. I went back last year to look at it again, and yes, it was 15-year-old technology. Actually, it could be better now. It could be faster. But what happens in Detroit, the centre of the American motor industry, the centre of the American motor industry, and there is in Ontario, across a very difficult, constrained border, tougher than Dover, there is an entire industry supplying parts, components, engines for that motor car industry. And it operates across a border which actually has tariffs on it too. And bear in mind that nobody in this negotiation... No, if you'll forgive me. Because I'm short of time. The simple truth is they operate even where there are tariffs. And we are proposing a non-tariff arrangement. There will be no tariffs here. The primary concerns will not be the collection of money. It will be other things that we have to... No, he'll forgive me. She'll forgive me. The issues that remain at the border will depend on the customs policy we decide on. And that is very, very clearly going to alter how that border operates. It includes rules of origin, as already been pointed out, tariff paid status, if we are in the future customs arrangement. That's more difficult, actually, than rules of origin, and regulatory compliance. None require action at the border. So all can be dealt with by electronic pre-notification or pre- or post-audit, either at origin or destination. Now, the most difficult issue in this negotiation relating to borders has been Northern Ireland. No doubt about that. There's no way, however, that a UK government is ever going to install a hard border in Northern Ireland. That is plain as a pikestaff. No UK government would risk the peace process that's been going on for decades.
Not required.
Neither will the Irish government. I cannot imagine in a century that an Irish government would do that either. What many people forget, however, is that there is already a border there. There's a currency border, there's a VAT border, there's an excise border, there's other tax borders. So they are operated north and south of the border by the British or the UK and the Irish tax collection and customs collection organisations operating together using intelligence-led intervention. Much is made of 300 border crossings. One of the outstanding issues with the customs being outside the customs union, as somebody has said, is the issue of rules of origin. But in Northern Ireland, there may be 300 border crossings, but there are only 6 ports. So rest of world imports can actually be surveilled and controlled very straightforwardly. So the issue there, which has got much more difficult since it's become politicised, it was actually working quite well in the negotiation before it became politicised, is eminently soluble. Soluble by technical means, soluble by cooperation between the two states. Yes, I'll give way to her.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. If what he says is so about the border, then why was he part of the government that agreed to the backstop last December?
Well, they didn't agree to the backstop. They agreed to the joint report, which said full alignment. And she'll remember, well, if she wants to listen to the answer, she'll remember we stand at the dispatch box and say we interpret full alignment as outcome alignment and relating directly to the issues in the north-south strands. Principally agriculture, transport, environment as it applies to the single electricity market. Those are the primary ones. And they are soluble, eminently soluble, by arrangements that already exist in Northern Ireland. For example, the carve-out on environmental legislation. So that's a very straightforward issue. It's been blown up, of course, into something else by the other side of the negotiations. But to come back to the point, the risks and costs of having a customs border are less than is being claimed. And what we're being given up to join a customs union is much more than is imagined. The European Union is a slow and not very effective negotiator of free trade agreements. We keep hearing about their negotiating power, their size. Actually, the fact that they represent 28 different countries means they come up with suboptimal outcomes all the time. And actually, we're the country that does least well out of the European Union's free trade agreements. They almost never involve services, for example, our primary trade. So the EU is slow, it's not very effective negotiator of trade deals. But we will be smaller, of course, but many, many countries that are smaller than us do very, very good trade deals. Switzerland's a very obvious example, and it's much more effective than ours. We're bigger, remember, by the way, when we talk about how small we are, we're bigger than the bottom 18 European countries put together. So we're not small by any normal measure of the word. We also have huge advantages over and above our economic weight. We have the English language, we have English law, we're leaders in life sciences, artificial intelligence, internet, medicine, a whole series of areas. And we are one of the leading countries in terms of intellectual exports. Services encompasses intellectual exports. And in that, the English language is the most powerful weapon possible. Yeah. So what this proposal would do is try and deal with a problem which is less bad than they think, and in doing so, throw away a power, throw away a right, which is incredibly important, much, much more important, they think. They are trying to defend a false past and giving up a real future. There we go.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is certainly interesting to follow the former BrExit Secretary and to reflect on the speech that he has given. And I think it does explain why it is, in the end, that he has resigned from the government. Because in the end, it just clashes with reality. And that is the unfortunate, I think, detail of the evidence that he has put forward to the House today. I want to speak in support of New Clause 1, but also to speak to my amendment, New Clause 6 and New Clause and Amendment 9, which is about having an impact assessment to be conducted on leaving the common external tariff, and also to speak against Amendment 73 and New Clause 36. Mr. Speaker, we have heard why the former BrExit Secretary believes that having any kind of customs union would somehow be bad for Britain and that we will be better off without it. And let me just first address what I think are the fallacies in the argument that he made today, because he argued, first of all, I think he was extraordinarily dismissive about the impact of checks at the border and the impacts of delays, the impacts of those additional costs, particularly for manufacturers and particularly for just-in-time production. Yep. And let me make no bones about it. I am speaking in support of manufacturing industry. I'm speaking strongly in support of manufacturing industry in my constituency. I will resist the temptation to go off in a tangent about Haribo and the Star Mix that they will sometimes let me test when I go to visit, but how important they say that it is for them to be able to bring ingredients to and fro smoothly across the border. And the impact of those delays, I will give way.
She noticed that there was no detail about the reality of the American and Canadian border that took 10 years to construct, cost £10 billion, deals with facial recognition, involves 100 companies in the automotive sector of Detroit and nothing more. Does she think that that is really not a model that will provide the frictionless trade our manufacturing sector needs?
Well, I completely agree with the Honourable Member. And also there's a sort of argument which the former Secretary seemed to be arguing that because companies do trade across borders which have customs checks, therefore we should rip up our customs-free borders. So because those trades take place, therefore it's okay to somehow add costs to our trading process. Why on earth would we do that? Why on earth would we add burdens to businesses that don't face them at the moment? Why on earth would we make it difficult and more costly for them? It's not the fact that we think all trade will stop. Of course it won't. The point is that that trade will become more costly, more burdensome, and we will be putting our businesses and our manufacturers at a disadvantage compared to their European neighbours and competitors. And that is unfair on our manufacturers, who, frankly, we in this House should be standing up for. And I certainly believe in standing up for Yorkshire manufacturing in our area. He also seemed to be arguing that because we coped with Operation Stack before, well, therefore, let's have more delays again. Well, yeah, we can cope, but Operation Stack cost businesses a fortune coping with those long delays. I'll give way to the Honourable Member.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Will she give some consideration to supporting our new Clause 36, which is a key piece of legislation if the UK is going to operate proper trade defences? She mentioned manufacturing, and I note that many Labour members have constituencies where workers potentially depend on the UK having good trade defences. Under the FCA, That wouldn't be possible without New Clause 36.
Yeah, let me just deal with New Clause 36. So I don't understand. If the government's saying that they're going to accept New Clause 36, I don't understand how this doesn't just rip a hole right into their white paper.
Of course it does.
Because New Clause 36 explicitly says that you cannot collect customs duties and excise duties at the border on behalf of another country unless they're going to do the same for you. Well, the white paper, as far as I can see, says here, however, the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK's tariffs and trade policy at the border for goods intended for the UK. Well, that is the opposite of New Clause 36. So has the government just ripped up its own white paper already in the space of what? Just like a couple of days? This is chaotic approach to something that is so serious and just shows, frankly, a ridiculous wobbling in the face of a small group of people who I do not believe speak for the majority of people in this country. I will give way to the honourable member.
That's right, Honourable Lady Gershon. That phrase in the white paper is actually a perfectly sensible arrangement. It's a very good thing to put in, because otherwise, if we adopt the new clause, 27 other countries will have to face up to the prospect of searching for new technology, setting up their own bureaucratic arrangements to accommodate the Brexiteers in my party in proceeding with the arrangements. We urgently need these EU negotiations to start with partners who can rely on us to stick to a consistent line, and it could be very damaging to change the basic position on such an important matter within 1 week.
I think the right honourable gentleman is right. I think on two things. First of all, that this kind of inconsistency and buckling in the face of objections from what I think is an unrepresentative group, I think is the wrong approach. But also, I think that these customs arrangements are also immensely important. Now, I understand that the government has put forward. No, I won't, because there is a time limit, and I want to finish early so that other members can come in. The other issue, I think, is that honourable members who are opposed to any form of customs union are really underestimating the significance of rules of origin checks burdens. And these, even just according to a government's own analysis, can potentially cost between 4 and 15% additional costs on businesses from doing rules of origin checks. I'll give away.
Did any company bother to do expensive rules of origin checks if paying the tariff, which might be as little as 2%, would be much cheaper than doing rules of origin checks? Simple as that.
OK, that is really flipped logic. Because what the honourable member is effectively saying is, do you know what, they don't have to do the rules of origin checks because they can all just pay the tariffs, and therefore, why on earth are we going through this whole process in the first place if all we're going to get is a tiny reduction in tariff that nobody's going to take advantage of in order to actually get any benefits? I'll give way to the honourable member.
The logic is very simple, actually. What empirical evidence shows is that in international trade, companies do seek to claim their rebates and do what is necessary in order to avoid tariffs when the tariff is less than 3% and not when it's above. And what that tells us is that the cost of rules of origin administration is less than 3%. Companies are rational operators, so the numbers she cited from a supposed government study were wrong.
I think either way, I think I would caution the honourable member on dismissing the rules of origins checks when this is the huge worry about the burden, particularly for small businesses. And there is a big difference for big and small businesses. It may be that for large businesses, actually, it is worth them claiming it back and because they can set up systems to do it. But for small businesses, this can be devastating, particularly for the huge number of small businesses that have not currently traded outside the EU and for whom rules of origins checks will be a new burden for the first time. And I return to my other point. Why on earth would we want to add these additional burdens and checks on businesses that haven't faced them before? We are in the very strange situation, I find myself, where I, as a Labour MP, am arguing far more strongly and passionately against these additional burdens on businesses than the hard right of the Conservative Party, who ought to have been arguing against burdens on businesses. I give way for the last time, but I am conscious of time.
I'm very grateful for giving way. isn't the rules of origin checks not only about tariffs and money to be paid, but also about things like protection and environmental protection and so on and so forth? It's not just about the money, it's about the products and where they're coming from, how they have been produced, and whether they actually conform with what we believe in.
The honourable member is right that we need to address the wider issues around friction at the border as well. And let me just say something about the government's facilitated customs agreement, because I understand what ministers are trying to do, and I understand they are trying to square a circle. They are trying to pull us out from the common external tariff and also not pay any of the penalties from being outside the common external tariff. But I think it is just a leap of faith that is implausible. And I think there are huge questions about whether this is deliverable, whether this is actually robust enough for the EU ever to sign up for it, because the government is expecting there to be sufficiently robust procedures in place for tariffs to be collected at the border for widgets coming in from the US or from other countries, and therefore to be no checks no spot checks, no additional checks on whether or not the forms are being filled in correctly, on whether or not this is being done accurately, on whether or not there is fraud, on whether or not there's not an incentive for companies to fill in the forms in one direction but then actually move the goods in another. And the reason that this is significant is because at the moment the EU Commission are taking action against the EU to recover what they believe is €2 billion of underclaimed customs as a result of the UK's failure to crack down on Chinese clothing importers' customs fraud. Now, whatever the rights and wrongs of that, the point is that the EU Commission and EU member states do not have confidence in our customs arrangements at the moment, never mind asking them to join in a huge leap of faith that they will be able to agree to our future facilitated customs arrangement in future. And I think, too, the government is relying on some whizzy, wonderful new technology that, look, I hope will come in place really quickly, but there are serious questions about how long that will take and what the consequences will be. So let me finally just turn to the why my amendment calls for a proper assessment to be done of being outside the common external tariff. A proper impact assessment. I still can't believe it hasn't properly been done. There hasn't seriously been a proper impact assessment of what these fantasy future trade deals are that are somehow going to make us better off, and what the additional burdens are going to be from being outside the common external tariff that will make us worse off. Let me finally refer to Amendment 73, which I think is one of the most destructive that the ERG group, some of the hard rights Conservative Party, have put forward. This removes any provisions from the bill that would be needed for a customs union. And they say the honourable member who chairs the ERG group has said that's okay because they'll have a future vote. Well, why should we have a future vote? Why not vote on it now? I think we should have a customs union, so let's have that vote now rather than vote to remove it from the bill. And so why on earth, for the sake of manufacturing, would we ditch those customs provisions? What the ERG want to do is remove the possibility of a customs union from this bill. And I'm astonished that government ministers want to accept that. I think that is deeply destructive and is actually going to make it harder for the government to get the kinds of customs arrangements that we need. It means that the fallback position, if its facilitated customs arrangement doesn't work, is no customs deal at all. That is deeply damaging for our manufacturers. And I would just also say this to my front bench as well. I hope that our front bench will also be voting against this deeply damaging ERG amendment, because I don't see how we can tolerate the damage that the hard right of the Conservative Party wants to do to our manufacturing industry. We need to be the party that is going to stand up for manufacturing industry to make sure that we can support our manufacturers getting the best possible deal as part of the Brexit process. We owe it to them to do that.
Hear. Has the Right Honourable Lady finished her speech? She has. I'm grateful to her. The Right Honourable Learned Gentleman Member for Rushcliffe will be the last person to speak under the 12-minute limit. By how much the subsequent limit has to be lowered is very much dependent upon the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman. Mr. Kenneth Clarke.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for calling me, and you may be disbelieving, but I will do my best to speak in less than 12 minutes, so as to be rather more pithy than usual. Mr. Speaker, for the last 40 years, we have achieved some quite remarkable transformations in the British economy, and we have made ourselves one of the most attractive economies in the world for inward investment, and developed an extremely competitive, modern economy, both in goods and in services. And it's not entirely attributable to the single market and the customs union, but it played a very large part. The United Kingdom is regarded by many of the great firms that invest in this country as the most business-friendly member of the European Union and the most attractive place to actually invest in a way that gives absolutely unfettered access to the largest developed international free trade area in the world. And I personally have never understood why we're seeking to detract from that. In the referendum campaign, absolutely nobody made a feature anywhere of saying we should withdraw from these arrangements, and certainly nobody advocated the virtues of putting in place at our ports and our borders customs checks, customs procedures, tariffs, regulatory divergence, and all the things that cause costs. I think the aim of my right honourable friend, the member for Holden Price, who's an old friend and for whom I have very considerable respect, rather is mine. He takes as the basis of his arguments that he wants Britain to be one of the most attractive, if not the most attractive, place for the investment that we need in future years. But with great respect, I think he goes to considerable ingenuity, based on his knowledge of the subject, of course, about the attempts which are made in other parts of the world to mitigate the consequences of not having a totally open border. The Canadian-US border is not, for most of its trade, totally free. It's not devoid of queues and delays. Now, the other argument we've had so far, just sort of dismissing our worries on this issue are, well, 20 minutes delay compared with 3 minutes delay, that isn't going to deter anybody. The fact is that the major manufacturers, I'll stick to the manufacturing because that I think is most accessible to the public, it's our remarkable turnaround in the car industry, which is the most obvious demonstration of where we've got to. But one of the reasons they come here is precisely because they can operate the most modern systems with absolutely no delay, hence the just-in-time supply lines and everything we've heard of. And it's no good saying, well, that doesn't matter because they don't have that anywhere else in the world. Once you change that, there is absolutely no doubt that you are increasing costs quite substantially compared with the costs that we have now. That is absolutely undeniable. Now during the referendum, some of us tried to raise the threat to our international trade and our inward investment that leaving the EU would involve. I debated with a very good advocate on the Remain side, Daniel Hannan, who's a very well-known MEP. Well, it was easy to debate with him because Dan was not advocating leaving the single market. It was quite plain. He was in favour. You've got quotes from him saying so. He knows a lot about it. When it was responded to by some of the leading publicised figures, most notably the recently resigned Foreign Secretary, he dismissed any suggestion that trade would change. The Germans would be persuaded by Mercedes just to leave the things completely as they were in some as yet unspecified and undescribed way. Well, now, the member for Uxbridge and his supporters are actually ignoring the advice, sometimes aggressively and derisively ignoring the advice being given to us by all the major international investors in this country, the Airbus, Jaguar Land Rover. They're dismissing the CBI, they're dismissing the Institute of Directors, which is not the most left-wing organisation I have ever encountered. Apparently, the Right Honourable Member Uxbridge understands far more about the attractiveness of this country to future investment in the next generations of aerospace and automobiles, which we need to anticipate. Nobody's going to close down a factory overnight if we go in for the daftest arrangements. But they will actually, they have to compete with other parts of their group for the next major investments. And the United Kingdom will go right down the list, because everywhere else in the European Union will be able to demonstrate that they are more attractive.
The key concern for me is that we seem to be separating EU trade and non-EU, but is it not the case that so much of our non-EU exports are from foreign-owned businesses who invest in this country for export precisely because of the attraction of the single market and so on?
Exactly. I quite agree. And that's why I tabled with my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, the amendments on the order paper. It's new clause 12, a customs union. Now, I have actually taken the view that whilst I can see nothing wrong with that amendment, I am prepared to try to get us out of this political chaos by giving the government's white paper a try. It is attempting to reach precisely the objectives that I am arguing for: frictionless trade, none of these procedures at the border. I cannot see what is wrong with the customs union. If anyone calls a vote on it, I shall abstain. I don't vote against amendments that I plainly agree with and that I have tabled. If a facilitated customs arrangement can be devised which achieves the same, well, good luck. And what I really think, what is most important, is that we do, now we've got the white paper, agree with our partners in the European Union that we now negotiate on this. We have wasted 2 years. We are facing laughable suggestions that we're going to solve all the problems now in the next 3 months, possibly by Christmas, if it slips. That is absolutely ludicrous. That's the uncertainty that is racking business and anybody with an interest in our economic future all over the country. So now we've actually got quite a large majority of the Cabinet to agree on it. I never thought the Cabinet we had was ever capable of agreeing on anything on this subject, because they've sincerely held completely opposite views on practically every aspect of it. We've got most of the Cabinet now behind it. I think we could give them a chance, and then, of course, we'll have lots of the developments that will take place as compromise takes place. With any luck, people who actually understand the subject will be allowed to try to come up with some workable version of this which achieves the essential objectives. I'm afraid the debate that the public are listening to infuriates the public, because it's all about personalities. They have not the faintest idea, most perfectly sensible members of the public, no real idea what we're talking about. Because throughout the entire debate, no one's ever given a proper explanation to the country of what a customs union even is, and what a single market even is, and what certificates of origin involve. That is inevitable. We've never debated these things before. But we do owe it to the public to have a slightly more sensible debate in future. Half the arguments that are used in the general debate don't understand what a trade agreement is with any other country. As things stand, if we leave with no deal, we'll be the only developed country in the world that doesn't have a trade agreement with any other country in the world, because it's not going to be easy to roll over all the other agreements we have with other countries which are based on the EU. We've driven the EU to actually achieve all those. There are problems with 28 member states, I agree, in negotiating, but the problems in America are far worse. All they want to do is export food to us. They won't open up their public procurement. They won't open up their service industries. I can't. They actually want us to give up the hated European rules on animal welfare and food standards and bind ourselves to the lower American rules on food standards. And so Congress, Washington, will be telling us what our standards are on those things in future, and we will be excluded from European markets and have to have a hard border with Northern Ireland and with the continent as well. And to listen to some of the opponents of the EU, You'd think other trade agreements just let you have all the advantages with no obligations. That all trade agreements involve mutual agreements on regulation of standards, health, safety, welfare, all the things that are relevant, which you mutually bind yourself to accept. There isn't a country in the world that will accept a trade agreement of the kind my honourable friend for North East Somerset seems to be describing when he warms to the subject. These are hugely important subjects we're debating. For the last week, we have been debating them in the national debate in the most farcical and chaotic way that I can remember in my political career. But the outcome is hugely important. If 1 week after the government has set out a policy which I'm prepared personally to give a fair wind to, I find that they're going to accept amendments like new clause 73 and new clause 36, which promptly change the policy in a quite ridiculous way, I shall despair. The government has only got to vote against those new clauses, and I'm absolutely certain that the opposition parties will not be able to think of any sensible reason why they should help my right honourable friends for North East Somerset and others to get a majority in this House. We could demonstrate they're a tiny handful of people and their arguments are most certainly not in the national interest.
The new limit will have to be no more than 8 minutes. Indeed, we're immensely grateful. I will come to other members, but Tom Brake.
You, Mr. Speaker. I must say, I hope, first of all, that the penny is dropping amongst those who inflicted the EU referendum on the country and the subsequent chaos, precisely what damage this Tory farce is doing to our standing in the world, our economy. We are 2 years on, and no real progress has been made. Tory rivalries, leadership ambitions and factionalism is making this country a laughingstock, and they should be ashamed on those benches. And I'm afraid to say the Labour front bench often contributes to the farce that we're seeing. Now, I want to, first of all, speak in favour of New Clause 1 and New Clause 12 if they're pushed to a vote, and also against New Clause 36, which is clearly a wrecking amendment. And I do hope that when the Minister responds, he's able to explain why it doesn't drive a coach and horses through the Chequers Agreement, because everyone in this House knows that it does, but ministers appear to be pretending that it does. And I'm going to make a little bit of progress. Now, I'd like to commend the Honourable Lady, the member for Broxtowe, who's no longer in her place, for the anger and passion that she brought to this debate, and also for starting to set out the consequences of Brexit. Because this debate so far has been rather short on consequences. There's been a lot about aspirations, ambition, ideology and speculation, but rather little about the consequences of Brexit. Now, there are some on the opposite benches who pretend that there's going to be no impact on the UK economy. There are others on the opposition benches, more honest ones, such as the member for Harwich and North Essex, who has just left his place, who frankly... Oh, no, he is, sorry, he is there, who is more honest. Now, I hope that he doesn't feel that I'm misinterpreting what he said, but I listened very carefully, as I hope other members did this morning, to him on Radio 4, on the Today programme, and I think what he did, perhaps paraphrasing what our outgoing Foreign Secretary have said, was in effect say F to business. He was saying that all businesses care about is profit, whereas actually what I think they care about often is whether they're able to do the jobs that they're required to do and provide the jobs that they provide in this country. So what I also want to speak, I'm very happy to give way, as I mentioned it.
Unlike probably the vast majority of honourable and right honourable members in this House, I actually used to work in manufacturing industry. I used to work for Ford Motor Company, and I used to then invest in manufacturing businesses. And it really is a bit rich for people who know next to nothing about manufacturing, lecture those of us who have been in business about what we know about. So the honourable gentleman dismisses the views of people like Sir James Dyson or JC Bamford, or many of the manufacturers that wanted to leave the European Union when we had the referendum?
First of all, he may be surprised to hear that I worked in business before I came into Parliament as well, and did work for, amongst others, manufacturing businesses. I'm interested that he mentioned the two businesses that, in fact, he can mention that are in favour of coming out of the European Union. We have heard rather a lot about the two businesses that he's referred to, one of which, of course, has relocated most of its production to China, so I'm not sure it's particularly well positioned to talk to us about Malaysia, to Malaysia. But I also want to talk about New Clause 7 and New Clause 8 and indeed 9. So New Clause 7 simply tries to ensure that the government does what I think everyone in this House wants it to do, which is actually set out the impact of what it's proposing in relation to customs arrangements on business, that it be required to do so. We have had, I think, a government that has ducked and dived in relation to impact assessments, was embarrassed when they were leaked, has done everything it can to stop that information getting out into the public domain. New Clause 7 is about making sure the government has to set out, 6 months after the royal assent of this Act, precisely what the impact on the UK economy would be of their proposals. And equally, in relation to New Clause 8, would have to set out precisely what the impact would be on Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland border, because there are concerns about that remaining. And of course, New Clause 37, I think, actually is quite deliberately seeking to do away with any prospect whatsoever of there being a withdrawal agreement, because I don't think, certainly not the Irish government, not the political parties in Northern Ireland, not the political parties here, no one wants to see a border in the Irish Sea. But I think in terms of leaving open the space to discuss the backstop arrangements, then I think New Clause 37, its purpose is to destroy the space in which those discussions can take place. And in relation to New Clause 9, and indeed Amendment 10, these are simply about taking back control. We've heard a lot about how this is about parliamentary sovereignty, about ensuring that Parliament has its say. Well, the purpose of New Clause 9 and Amendment 10 is to ensure that the government don't railroad through things in this House using statutory instruments, using tertiary legislation like public notices to push through things because it's convenient for them, to avoid the scrutiny that Parliament is entitled to have. Mr. Speaker, well within my time limit, I'd just like to conclude by saying that I'm pleased that we are at least starting to discuss the real consequences of Brexit on business. There are some amendments here which I hope may be pressed to a vote in terms of New Clause 1 or New Clause 12. We do need to get into, I think, some real debate about what will ensure that the successful manufacturers in this country are able to continue to operate in that way, and those new clauses will certainly enable that to happen.
Priti Patel.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to move New Clause 36 in my name and the name of my honourable friends and right honourable members of the House. I want to be clear that a strong deal that delivers a new equal partnership between the UK and the EU based on cooperation to advance mutual interests while respecting the sovereignty of this country is, of course, in everyone's interest. It is also a golden opportunity for our country to become a free and independent nation, setting up its own laws and in control of its own destiny. I don't think anybody in this House would disagree with that. And of course, while we understand that while the government is in a negotiation process, all negotiations require a degree of give and take. And of course, there are lines, red lines, and certain lines cannot be crossed. And this is clear as well in terms of the debates that we are having right now, in terms of the proposal and the propositions that we are taking to the European Union. Now, New Clause 36 cements into legislation the principle of reciprocity. It is clear and unambiguous. It was disappointing to see in the White Paper that it did not commit to that. What was in the White Paper is a proposal that does not deliver an equal partnership, but actually one that doesn't put us on an even playing field. The White Paper states that because the EU would need to be confident that goods cannot enter its customs territory without the correct tariff and trade policy being applied, we will effectively adopt much of that policy and collect tariffs on behalf of the EU. But the White Paper then states that the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK's tariff and trade policy at its border for goods intended to the UK. So we are being asked to allow this legislation to pass that will mean that the government can agree with the EU to collect taxes for them and provide assurances about goods entering the UK heading to the EU. But we do not expect the same arrangements to be provided by the EU in return. So why are we planning to give the EU assurances and confidence which we do not expect them to provide us in return? This, of course, Mr. Speaker, of course I'll give way.
Thank the right honourable lady for giving way. So can she confirm whether it's her view that her amendment conflicts with or is in line with the government policy as per the White Paper published last week?
Well, I think also I've just made the point as well that it was disappointing to see in the White Paper that the principle of reciprocity wasn't in there. And my honourable friend has already heard me say that I want to see an equal partnership. And what has been proposed is not an equal partnership. It is yet another compromise that we are making with nothing in return. And so the government has the chance to address this by backing this amendment. The EU will then know in the negotiations that they cannot accept attempt to steamroller the government on this issue, and that if they want to benefit from the UK collecting their tariffs, then they need to adopt a similar reciprocal arrangement. So far in the Brexit negotiations, Mr. Speaker, we have negotiated, collectively the government has, in good faith. We have been open and transparent and have already made many compromises and concessions. That is right and that is fair. The Prime Minister, within a week of taking office, gave up our turn to hold the EU presidency in the second half of 2017 as a gesture of goodwill. We have offered guarantees to citizens' rights as early as possible, but the EU would not accept that. We have offered £40 billion of British taxpayers' money, and yet the trade deal that would benefit this country and the EU is being blocked by EU officials who are, quite frankly, not engaging with us. So I think the point here is that as we progress to the next stage of negotiations on the future of the UK-EU relationship, Britain does need to be an equal partner with the EU and not their tax collector. This amendment means that there would have to be a genuine reciprocal arrangement established, that they also put into law that the UK will not be part of an EU VAT regime and that Northern Ireland will be treated the same as the rest of the UK. We are proposing putting into law as a safeguard what the government has said it wants. Now, the public want to know that their political leaders will stay true to the promises made to them that Brexit means Brexit, and that we are putting in place plans for an economic and political renewal of our nation. And that, of course, means the government having the desire, the interest to listen and to modify these proposals, but at the same time listen to the public at large.
The right honourable lady completed her speech with commendable brevity, upon which I congratulate her. Mr. Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a great privilege to follow the honourable lady from Witham. We sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee together and agree on very much that the Foreign Affairs Committee does. I'm afraid to say we agree on nothing with regards to Brexit, and we have those battles within the committee. But it's very unfortunate that we've been left here this evening with a set of amendments from the group of Conservative rebels that want to take us off a cliff edge. That's what these are designed to do. And we have had unconfirmed reports that the government may accept these amendments. I don't know if the Minister from the Treasury front bench would nod to say that he is going to accept them. But if he does, I hope he's got a match or a cigarette lighter in his pocket, because he'd be just as well to set alight the Chequers Agreement in terms of what the consequences for these amendments would be. And on top of all of that, we have the former Secretary for exiting the European Union, who is back in his place, who must be now regretting leaving the government, given that he threatened to resign 5 times, has eventually gone through with a resignation on the Chequers Agreement that's just about to be ripped up by his own front bench to a much more hardline position to take us off a cliff edge in terms of a hard Brexit. If he'd only stayed on a few more days, he may have been able to see through the proposals that he started. I'm happy to give way to the right honourable gentleman, given that I've mentioned them.
Justice Helen, that nearly everything in his sentence he said was untrue.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that it is untrue and he would have resigned regardless, but surely there's some regret. Well, maybe actually we should be glad that he resigned, given that he stood up in this chamber as a former Secretary of State and managed to persuade the House, or try and persuade the House, that Operation Stack was something that was positive for the country in terms of having trucks and lorries queued up at our ports. I've never known a Secretary of State to look at a tragedy in terms of what might have happened to our economy had Operation Stack continued for much, much longer and turn it into something positive. And if that's the kind of argument he's going to give the country and indeed this House, we should be making sure we vote down most of these particular amendments. I just find it extraordinary that, having gone through all this process, and these debates seem to me a little bit like déjà vu, that we have arguments about the customs union, about the single market, and we are still here, a week away from this Parliament proroguing for the summer recess. The government have managed to botch together what is now called the Chequers Agreement, and within a week has completely torn it apart by pandering again, as the Right Honourable Gentleman for Rushcliffe says, to 30 or 40 people on the hard right of the Conservative Party, who would be much more honest just to stand up and say that they want the cliff edge hard Brexit, rather than putting amendments down to this bill that is driving a coach and horses through the agreement that the government have managed to come together on. I'm happy to give way.
Would the honourable gentleman really be proposing that the 163 independent members of the WTO are somehow teetering on a cliff edge, or doing something rather odd, or are they just simply normal trading nations trading with each other freely? Because I find this cliff edge statement rather peculiar, because it doesn't treat the facts.
Well, I'll tell you who's teetering on the cliff edge. It's the 10 or 12,000 people in my constituency who work in the financial services sector that are teetering on the cliff edge. It's the advice and analysis we've had from his own government's treasury, who says that even by staying in the customs union, the single market is the least worst option for this country, and to go down the WTO rules that he suggests in his intervention that we go round leaves this country teetering on the edge of a GDP reduction of somewhere between 9 and 16%, depending on which part of the country you live in. If that's the kind of positive argument for taking us out of the European Union, then I think the country needs to be given a people's vote in terms of that, if that's the kind of attitude that people want in terms of whether or not we're going down the right track. And I think that's why the Honourable Lady for Brostow's brought new Clause 1, and indeed she didn't really mention new Clause 12, but I think that in terms of a customs union gives us a platform that could unite the vast majority of this House. And I agree with the Right Honourable Gentleman from Rushcliffe. When the division bell rings on new Clause 36 and Amendment 73 tonight, we should all go down the lobby against them to show up how many people are actually in this House that want to protect the future prosperity of this country, or want to take away any future prosperity for their own narrow ideological needs. And I do say this to my own front bench, that I do hope that when the division bell goes on these amendments, we do vote against them, and we do make a stand against what these hardline right-wing Brexiteers are trying to do to our country. Because there is absolutely no way you can achieve what the government wants us to try and achieve of frictionless trade while putting in place a set of policies that put hurdles on that particular trade. There is no VAT alignment with these particular amendments. If you have no VAT alignment, you have no backstop. If you have no backstop, you have no withdrawal agreement. If you have no withdrawal agreement, you have to have a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And if that's the aspiration of some of these amendments, then there has to be a long, hard look when we look back in the future to the way we're just about to put the single largest element of self-harm ever into this country, about what people are actually trying to achieve here. And I think the Honourable Lady from Broxtow's introductory remarks when moving new Clause 1 sums this up. She was attacked by her own party in what were pretty disgraceful remarks from some of her own party, when she is merely trying to put forward the argument to save this country from doing economic damage to itself. What a remarkable thing to happen when the arguments are just trying to come forward in terms of what we are trying to achieve. So we've got here in front of us two bills, the bill this evening and the bill tomorrow. Merely the government has to put in place, if they look at new Clause 12, to keep the customs union and the single market on the negotiating table. New Clause 12 doesn't say to implement it, it merely says to keep it on the negotiating table, and that's what I think would be in the best interest of this country. And I say to the Minister, and I agree with the Honourable Member from Broxtowe, the Minister is one of the best ministers in government. I disagree with the vast majority of things that he does, but he's courteous, he's intelligent, he always answers questions in the best way he possibly can. And he can't be sitting there this evening. He can honestly be sitting there this evening, ready to accept these 4 amendments, thinking that it's in the best interest of not only the country, but of on the Chequers Agreement that the Prime Minister's managed to cobble together last Friday. It's time we need people to stand up on that front bench with a bit of backbone for the interests of this country. And by the time we go into the division lobby, very late on Tuesday night, when the customs bill that we've got in front of us here and the trade bill tomorrow are passed in this House, the front bench can either say that they've stood up to the hard right of this country and stopped economic Armageddon, or they can say they've done the right thing.
Mr. Lawrence Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak to new clause 37, which is tabled in my name and that of my right honourable friends. I'd also like to move new clause 37 at the appropriate time, which will make it unlawful for Her Majesty's Government to enter into arrangements under which Northern Ireland forms part of a separate customs territory to Great Britain. And the purpose of the amendment is simple. It's to secure the future of the United Kingdom. And I speak as a proud unionist and a friend of Northern Ireland. I've had the honour of working closely with people across Northern Ireland, having been chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee for 7 years, and before that a shadow minister in Northern Ireland for 5 years. I also interestingly co-chaired the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly for something like 5 years. So I do believe that we've got a lot to fight for Northern Ireland. But this amendment, I think, provides a guarantee which shows that we value the Union and recognise the importance of strengthening it, but also it acknowledges the importance and the value of our most important trading arrangement, and that is the UK internal market. And above all, this amendment contributes towards upholding the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom and safeguards the Union for the future. It reinforces a view which I'm confident is shared across this House, that we cannot accept a deal which would allow Northern Ireland to be considered as a separate customs territory to Great Britain. I recognise that this is the view the Prime Minister has put at the forefront of our negotiations. Certainly.
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and really reiterate that point that the new clause that he puts before the House tonight simply underlines and reaffirms what has been said from that dispatch box now on 4 separate occasions by the Prime Minister. And he's absolutely right to nail this into this, because we may not always have the luxury of having a unionist Prime Minister.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for that, and I, of course, completely agree with him, although I hope we always do have a unionist Prime Minister, and many of us will be certainly working towards that end for many, many years. The Prime Minister in December said that the whole of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, will leave the EU Customs Union and the EU single market. Nothing in the agreement I have reached alters that fundamental fact. So if nothing has changed, then I really am confident, and I understand it is the case, that the government will support this amendment. But during the last 2 years, we've had many polarising debates on our withdrawal from the European Union, but to me this amendment is straightforward and should be supported by anyone who values and believes in the Union. It's not a matter of leave or remain, it's about protecting the Union and ensuring that any deal we secure with the European Union upholds the constitutional integrity of the UK. But as well as protecting Northern Ireland's constitutional position in the UK, this amendment is also about protecting the economy of Northern Ireland by securing our most important single market, that is, of the UK itself. There are no absolute figures, but estimates by the Northern Ireland Statistics and Research Agency suggest that external sales of goods and services between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK were worth £14 billion in 2016, and that represents approximately 58% of Northern Ireland's total external sales. So to jeopardise this by subjecting Northern Ireland to extra border arrangements effectively down the Irish Sea would be foolish. Earlier this year, the Prime Minister rightly rejected the European Commission's proposed version of the backstop, which would have treated Northern Ireland differently from the rest of the United Kingdom. As the Prime Minister has said a number of times, no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to it. I understand that this is still the view of the Government. Therefore, this is not an amendment which looks to tie the Government's hands. Rather, it's an amendment which galvanises the Government's position on this issue and signals to the people of Northern Ireland that they will not be left behind or left out. The issue regarding the Irish border is being used as a red herring by the European Union. As the Prime Minister has agreed with me on a number of occasions, we cannot know what arrangements, if any, would be needed on the border until we know the details of any deal which we have with the European Union. And to think opposite to that is to put the cart before the horse. Her Majesty's Government, the Irish Government and politicians of all colours in Northern Ireland have said that they don't want to see a hard border in Ireland. And when we say hard border, we're not talking about troops being stationed along that border. That is not going to happen. Nor will whatever arrangements we reach with the EU provoke violence along the border. Those years have surely gone. What will happen, though, is what has been happening for a very long time. The two jurisdictions already have different laws, different currencies, different VAT rates, different levels of corporation tax, different fuel duties, different levels of tourism tax, and different levels of air passenger duty. Yet trade takes place with people crossing the border each day, some people several times a day. And some checks are carried out at various places in the north and the south. And that is how it will continue to be, without the disruption to trade and to everyday life, which some people predict. There is therefore no need for discussions about the border in Ireland to hold up the wider trade talks with the European Union. Nor is there any need to threaten Northern Ireland's position within the UK, nor Northern Ireland's economy during those talks. And this amendment will ensure that this will not be the case. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, the Prime Minister had repeatedly said that the backstop proposals regarding Northern Ireland were something no Prime Minister of the United Kingdom could ever agree to. And this new clause enshrines that policy in law. Thank you.
Extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman. Caroline Lucas, 8 minutes.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to give my support to all those who have been arguing for continued membership of the Customs Union, and therefore new Clause 1. I think it's really clear from everything we've heard today that if we're to avoid serious economic hardship, then membership of the Customs Union is essential. And frankly, the wrecking ball which the hard Brexiters would bring to British business and British industry is frankly pretty extraordinary, and all for what? The Prime Minister had it pretty much right when she spelt it out, saying that we export more to Ireland than we do to China, almost twice as much to Belgium as we do to India, nearly 3 times as much to Sweden as we do to Brazil. It's not realistic to think we could just replace European trade with these new markets. Now, that was in April 2016, but I would contend, as the Prime Minister herself is fond of saying, that nothing has changed. But the point that I would like to raise in my brief minutes this evening is the issue of standards, and I want to speak to my Amendment 71 in particular. Because Clause 8 of the bill sets out factors to which the Treasury must have regard when considering the rate of import duties that ought to apply to any goods. And those include the interests of UK consumers, the desirability of maintaining and promoting productivity and external trade. My Amendment 71 would add to the factors to which the Treasury must have regard when considering the rate of import duties. Firstly, the interests of UK producers, and most particularly to farmers, and secondly, the desirability of ensuring that UK standards of animal welfare, food safety and environmental protection are not undermined by imports produced to lower standards. Now, the Prime Minister has said at PMQs in February 2017 and many times since that we should be proud in the UK that we have some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world, indeed one of the highest scores for animal protection in the world. She went on to say that leaving the EU will not change that. We are committed to maintaining, she said, and where possible improving standards. Similarly, we've heard the Environment Secretary on many occasions saying that we need to maintain and, where possible, enhance environmental and animal welfare standards. However, if the UK is unable to protect its farmers from being undermined by lower quality imports, those farmers are likely to find it very hard to be competitive. They're likely to find it quite hard to go further in terms of improving their animal welfare and environmental standards. So accordingly, when negotiating new trade agreements, it will be vital that the UK insists on the inclusion of a clause permitting it to require imports to meet UK animal welfare and environmental standards. And I've tabled an amendment to the trade bill to that effect. But if that were not to happen, if we were to lose that principle of prohibiting products that don't meet our standards, then we need some kind of backstop. And that is where Amendment 71 to this bill comes in, by giving ministers the power to place differential tariffs on imports. And essentially, imports that don't conform to UK welfare standards would be subject to tariffs that are sufficiently high to safeguard UK farmers. Now, that would ensure that UK farm businesses aren't undermined by low-quality products. It would ensure that UK consumers are protected from lower-standard goods like chlorine-washed chicken, ractopamine red-fed pork, and hormone-treated beef, to name but a few, by placing tariffs on imports that don't meet the UK standards. Now, those tariffs would effectively make the cost of those lower welfare products an awful lot higher in order to protect our standards here in the UK. And my members will know. Sure.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable lady for giving way. She's making an important point about the value of trade defences in our armoury, and would she consider supporting new clause 36, which is essential for the UK to be able to operate its own trade defence policy? Because if the EU is not collecting our tariffs for us at our border, there will be nothing that we can potentially do about that.
Well, I'm afraid I don't share his faith in our own government continuing to keep higher standards. We've already had some very clear criticisms of New Clause 36 for very many other reasons, and the way in which it basically rides a coach and horses through the kinds of customs union that we want to see. So no, I will not be supporting New Clause 36. But I was going on to give those examples of ways in which, in the US, for example, their food standards are very much lower than our own. And while many may find the prospect of eating chlorine-washed chicken disturbing, there appears to be no clear scientific evidence that it poses a substantial risk to human health. But what it does do is basically be linked to very poor animal welfare on farms and at slaughter. Similarly, ractopamine is a feed additive used to promote growth in pigs. Its use is permitted in the US but prohibited in the EU. There's evidence that it has a detrimental impact on pig welfare. The Humane Society of the US states that it causes death, lameness, stiffness, trembling and shortness of breath in farm animals. Possible concerns have been expressed about its impact on human health as well. So simply, Mr Speaker, my Amendment 71 would require the Treasury, when considering the rates of import duty that ought to apply to any goods, to have regard to the interests of UK producers, like farmers, and to the desirability of ensuring that the UK standards of animal welfare, food safety and environmental protection are not undermined by imports produced to lower standards. So I will wrap up my comments then. As I say, I'm also supporting a number of these other amendments, including the amendment around impact assessments that I think are vitally important when it comes to the impact on economics, the economic situation in this country, the impact on the Northern Ireland border. But I did think it was important just to put something on the record in this debate about the impact on animal welfare and environmental standards as well.
Thank you. Greg Hands.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Thank you. And can I just start off by saying that these are, I agree with my honourable friend, the member for Halton, Price and Howden, that these are vital pieces of legislation, the bill today and tomorrow. I'm rising specifically to speak against new clause 1 in the name of my honourable friend, the right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, and her new clause 12, new clause 6 from the right honourable lady, the member for Pontefract, and new clause 11 in the name of the Leader of the Opposition. Now, Mr Speaker, I speak as somebody who actually voted Remain in June 2016, but having given some time to study these matters at close hand, and I believe having an objective and pragmatic and reasonable approach, I agree with my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, that being objective and pragmatic here is vital, that I think it would be a grave error to enter into a customs union with the European Union whilst being outside of the European Union. I'm going to give 5 reasons why I believe that to be the case. Much of the debate so far has focused, important though it is, on narrow considerations, important considerations about how a border works. But there's much more to a customs union than simply the operation of a border or a set of borders, which I think is very important to bring into this debate. Now, let me first of all ask whether there is any similar, before anybody proposes going down this route of entering into a customs union with the European Union, whether there's anybody who currently does this. And yes, there is. There is the case of Turkey. OK, it's not in the customs union for everything, or a customs union for everything, but it is for most goods, with the exception of agricultural goods. And the Turkish example is very instructive. If we were to go back 23 years to when Turkey joined this customs union, their direction of travel was the entire opposite of our direction of travel. They were looking to enter the European Union and saw joining a customs union with all of its disadvantages and imperfections as being a staging post for joining the European Union. We, of course, are operating in the opposite direction. Now, what does that do if you're in a customs union with somebody and you go into a trade agreement? What happens is this, is that market, Turkey, must give access to its markets under that trade agreement because it has signed up to the common external tariff. However, because Turkey is not subject itself to that trade agreement, because the trade agreement is with the European Union, I'm going to carry on, I'm going to explore this point. Because Turkey is not subject to that agreement, because it is not a member of the European Union, Turkey must then negotiate its own trade agreement with that counterpart. It's not obliged to do so, and various counterparts have agreed a trade agreement with the European Union, but not agreed one with Turkey. Now, I'm going to explore my points in the available time. But no, I'm going to carry on. So the lesson here, Madam Deputy Speaker, is actually these partners will be less likely in many ways to do a deal with an economy, the 5th largest economy in the world. If you can get access to that economy through a trade agreement with the European Union, such that Britain would be forced to lower its tariffs, that makes actually the people you might want to speak to being more likely to be in Brussels than in London. The second reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the pursuit of an independent trade policy and trade agreements. Now, if we are no longer setting our own tariffs and they're set by somebody else, that weakens our ability to have a trade negotiation and come to a trade agreement. By definition, we have a lot less to offer. The third area, which remarkably, Madam Deputy Speaker, hasn't been explored at all tonight, has been the whole area of trade remedies. I am amazed that the Labour Party wants us to join, I'm not sure what the official front bench view is, but I think it is that as well, wants us to enter into a customs union with the European Union. Who would actually do our trade defences? Now, trade defences, Madam Deputy Speaker, are incredibly important. It is the topic du jour in the disputes at the moment between the United States, between China and other counterparts. If we were in a customs union, it would seem to me likely that it would be Brussels that would be making the decisions on trade remedies that would apply to the United Kingdom. We would not have a seat at that table when those decisions were being made that would affect our industry. Moreover, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is likely to be against WTO rules for Brussels to make decisions that might affect the United Kingdom, because under WTO rules you have to show the impact to your own market, not somebody else's market. So it's not clear to me at all. I'm going to use the 3 remaining minutes, I'm afraid. The fourth area, which again is a remarkable area for Labour to ignore, is the potential regulation of the NHS and other public services. I think they've forgotten the TTIP debates from 4 or 5 years ago. They got very agitated about TTIP and the prospect of granting access to the NHS and other key public services in this country by a European Union trade agreement. Now they seem to be happy, potentially through a customs union, for the European Union to negotiate potential access to the NHS in our markets. But even worse, we don't have a seat at the table when that trade agreement is being set up. And I find it absolutely remarkable, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the Labour Party is prepared to do that. And my final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, is this. Again, another point which has not been introduced in this debate, but is a vital part of this piece of legislation, and that is trade preferences for the developing world. Again, something which I think there's cross-party support on for this country doing more and better. The bill allows for the transition of a scheme of trade preferences, the UK to have its own scheme of trade preferences, taking overnight the European Union scheme of GSP, GSP+, everything but arms, but crucially with the ability to improve on that scheme. Now, if you stay in a customs union with the European Union, you are strangling that ability in its infancy to do better than what the European Union currently does on trade preferences. Actually, Madam Deputy Speaker, from what I know, and trade ministers and other governments I've spoken to, like Pakistan, like India, like Bangladesh, like Sri Lanka, all really important markets for this country, really important friends. They would welcome the ability for the UK to offer better access for their goods than the European Union currently does. I'm not saying that is a policy decision we will make today, but the ability in this piece of legislation for us to be able to do that, I think, is extremely important and a very underrated part of this legislation. The ability to offer better access, whatever you think of the current access offered by the European Union. I don't think anybody would say the UK would be unable to offer better access, have our own preference scheme, and that is neglected as well in this debate. So finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, whatever you think of the original decision in June 2016, I put it to the House that I think it would be a grave error, and it's not just a question of formalities and practicalities at the border. There's a lot of other really important issues here on trade remedies, on trade preferences for the developing world, that I think it would make it a very, very bad idea to enter into a customs union with the European Union. I very much support this piece of legislation and urge the rejection of those new clauses.
Nick Deacon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I apologise for the fact I had to go to statutory instrument and missed part of the debate, but I was in at the beginning. I'm here now, and it's a pleasure to follow the member for Chelsea and Fulham, who brings us back to the detail of the bill which went through committee and is now being reported to this House, which is where I want to focus my remarks. I was very concerned about the fact that the dumping methodology that was being put forward might not address the concerns of the UK steel industry, and I'm pleased that Member Stafford put down Amendment 25 in his name, but I'm also pleased that the government has been engaging with members across the House, and on last week did, in a written parliamentary question responding to the member for Middlesbrough South and East Cleveland, underlined the commitment to protecting UK industry where it is suffering injury as a result of dumped imports, and went on to make very clear that they would not allow that happen and use mechanisms for calculating dumping methods which, on the base of it, seem to have the support of industries like steel and ceramics. So I very much welcome the fact that the government has been listening and working with key industries during the passage of the bill and as it's brought back here. However, I'm less convinced with the situation in relation to the economic interest test. I was rather hoping, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in line with the rhetoric that we've heard throughout the whole argument for leaving the European Union, that we took the advantage and opportunities of leaving the European Union to reduce any bureaucratic pressure on industries like the steel industry rather than adding bureaucratic pressures in there. And if we look at the economic interest test that's placed in here, it adds extra layers of economic interest test compared with what currently exists in the European Union. So we have the genius of a government bringing something forward even more complex than what we already have in the European Union. That, I did not think, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the purpose of what we were about. Yep. Maybe I was naive. I think we raised in committee concerns about the proliferation of economic interest tests built into the regime, that measures must pass before tariffs can be introduced. Of particular concern was the fact that they will first be conducted by the Independent Trade Remedies Authority and then again by the Secretary of State, theoretically on a completely different basis. And as such, we pushed for the Secretary of State's power in relation to the tests to be curtailed and at most to act as a sense check of what this TRA had conducted. Anything more than this, I believe, introduces an unacceptable level of potentially political interference into this process and an unnecessary block into terms of what's happening. The real worry is that at this time it will delay bringing in trade remedies and therefore subject industry to potentially more damage. However, the government has introduced its own amendments to the bill, which do go some way towards addressing these concerns on Amendments 103 and 108. But I think that if we move on, the government's amendments 110 to 112 and 116 to 118 seek to deal with the issue of replicating tests. And I don't think they do that sufficiently well, which is why I will be supporting the amendments in the name of the Leader of the Opposition on Amendment 21, which I think achieves a better outcome. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd just like to say a little bit about safeguard measures and adjustment plans. I'm concerned that the government intends to require any industry requesting safeguard measures to submit adjustment plans demonstrating how it will adjust to new market circumstances before any safeguard investigation could be launched. This would essentially require an industry to demonstrate what changes it was making to its operations, including efficiencies and rationalisations, before a safeguard investigation could even start. UK Steel and others have pointed out that in situations such as those we currently face in relation to the US 232 tariffs, such a requirement would be unjustified. Industry should not have to make major adjustments to deal with what is likely to be a temporary situation introduced by a non-WTO compliant actions of another government. So I'm pleased that the government has introduced Amendment 113 to modify this requirement, allowing the TRA to waive the requirement when it deems necessary or suitable. However, I think it would be better if that pressure on industry at that point when industry is already under significant pressure was not there. So I really, Madam Deputy Speaker, I just wanted to put those concerns on the record so that the government has opportunities during the passage of this bill in the other place and before it comes back here to make further improvements.
Craig McKinley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on Amendment 73 and I would wish to move that amendment in my name and the name of honourable and right honourable members at the appropriate time. I think it now has to be a settled will that we're not going to be in a or the customs union with the European Union in the future. That became very clear with the very hours of debate that we had in the EU withdrawal bill, both in this place and in the other place. It became a new act. It's clear under the Chequers deal. It's clear in the Future Relationships White Paper. The statement, "We will not be in the customs union," has passed through statements by the Prime Minister at Lancaster House, Mansion House, and on the floor of this House on occasions far too numerous to mention. So if we are not to be in a customs union, and that was clearly the compact that was made by the Conservatives and the Labour Party in their manifestos of last year, the compact that was made with the public. It is clearly the will of the people as expressed in the June 2016 referendum. I don't think there could have been any doubt as to the clarity. It was mentioned by all involved in that debate, no matter what side that they supported. So it's clearly the will of the people, it's clearly the will of the Prime Minister, it's clearly the will of the Cabinet, and whilst we were negotiating and passing the EU withdrawal bill, it was similarly the will by a majority of this place. Now, my friend from, honourable friend from North East Somerset said earlier on in one of his interventions that, if necessary, if there were to be a customs union with some part of this world, there would be, at that right time, primary legislation that would also incorporate any requirements of the government's Amendment 16A, that my Amendment 73 is trying to nullify. So I certainly hope, given those settled wills, that my amendment will be supported by the government, because anything else does not square with the manifesto on which we were elected, and it certainly actually doesn't square with the manifesto upon which the Labour Party were elected either. Now, we have to examine why on earth, under really any circumstance, putting customs union aside, would we want to stay in the arrangements for the administration of VAT that the EU has. It's quite odd. It actually encourages trade to be to buy from the EU in preference to actually buying from domestic markets. Let me put that into a little bit of context. Let me give you the imaginary widget that sells for £100 in the UK by a UK supplier, £100 by an EU supplier, or £100 by a US supplier. In the case of the purchase from a UK supplier, depending on the trade terms, you might have to pay within 30 days, and you've got a 3-monthly VAT cycle, one would have to actually have a cash flow of £120 to buy it. And then some months later, depending on the timing of your VAT return, you would get the £20 back. If you were to buy from a US trader, you would have to pay the £20 input VAT upfront as it crossed the border. But in the case of buying from the EU supplier, there is like an imaginary VAT on the acquisition is created that you self-charge and then output later when it's sold in the UK. But the cash flow is to actually spend that only £100 with the EU supplier in terms of cash flow. And so, perversely, we have created, by being in the EU VAT system, a requirement, almost a push towards competition that favours buying from abroad. Now, another factor, and I really do hope that Labour members take this on board this evening, that if we were to adopt the VAT directives in perpetuity, as it seems that now many on the other side would like to adopt as all part of staying in the customs union, I really wonder what those members, those honourable members from Walthamstow, from Dewsbury and from Birmingham Yardley, who I did alert that I would be mentioning them this evening, with their campaign against the tampon tax, how are they going to actually stand up in public and say, oh, by the way, I've abandoned that idea. I took part in that debate in this House and it was supported across the chamber. Are they really, are members across the other side really going to say to the electorate, I'm sorry, that's all gone now? Because we're actually in favour of customs union, we're in favour of staying in the VAT directives, which are the reason why all these years of EU membership we've been unable to do anything about these hated taxes. And I'd extend those hated taxes to things like solar panels and insulation products. Would any rational person in this House put VAT on solar panels and insulation products? I don't think they would. But we have to do it because the EU requires it. Wouldn't we rather like to reduce VAT on domestic heating and fuel? I think we would generally, because that is a solution, I will. I think I will enjoy to continue. So please, sir.
Did the honourable member notice that in March 2016 that the European Union agreed that on the so-called tampon tax issue to allow zero rating? So the point he made is completely debunked.
Well, I'm sorry, that must have passed me by, because I certainly know, that to get round the difficulties that were caused by the tampon tax and the significant debate we had in this chamber that I was a part of, the government actually agreed to sort of equivalate the amount that was collected to actually pass it to charity. So it seems bizarre we haven't actually taken the steps that are available. And the other thing about going along with the VAT directives and how VAT is actually managed, we have been subject to the missing trader intra-community fraud, the so-called carousel fraud. And that cost this country last year £1.7 billion. It's estimated to cost the EU as a whole into the tens of billions of pounds. And over the period of the administration of VAT in its current form, it could have cost anything up to £100 billion across the EU. Are we really saying that these failed systems are something that we want to be perpetuously attached to? Now, the Prime Minister has said very clearly that we will be in control of our tax policy. And just last week, following Chequers, the Secretary of State for the Environment also confirmed that we can't actually set our own taxes as we wish to at the moment, because VAT is set in accordance with EU rules. So that is another area in which we will be sovereign. So in my support of the amendment that is in my name and others tonight, this would actually make sure that no matter what the future holds, they will need primary legislation to do this. We cannot have the vestiges of some of the worst VAT rules that I think anybody could ever imagine remaining on our statute book. So for that reason, for that powerful debate on tampon tax, I certainly hope that others across this House will be in support of this Amendment 73 this evening. Thank you.
The honourable gentleman completed his oration. He has. Right, we're grateful to him. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we had the referendum result, and given the bitterness during the result, I had absolutely no doubt that despite the vote that there was, the overwhelming vote, we were going to see a guerrilla warfare which would be conducted against the will of the people of the United Kingdom. And we have seen it over the last year and a half, fought out in this place and fought out in TV studios, newspapers, etc. And I think that the amendments that we have tonight to this bill fall into one of those two categories. People who will give a whole variety of reasons, but basically want to move amendments to this bill which keeps us essentially in the institutions of the EU, which bound us for so many years and which people voted to be free of. And on the other side, those who wish to remain true to the vote of the people and make sure that everything is done to deliver on the promises that were made during the referendum. Northern Ireland, unfortunately, and it's featured in nearly every speech here tonight, has been caught in the crossfire in that guerrilla warfare between those who wish to keep us in the EU and those who wish to honour the result of the referendum. And the border between Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, the peace in Northern Ireland has been thrown around willy-nilly. And to be quite frank, people in Northern Ireland feel abused in this whole process. I have heard people in this place talk about the Belfast Agreement as if it was their bedtime reading, and they probably don't even know what the document looks like. And yet it has been suggested that if we don't abide by those who wish to keep us in the customs union and a single market, we're going to have a hard border in Northern Ireland. and that's going to affect the peace. I don't actually know what this hard border is going to look like. But I can tell you one thing. If they think that a couple of border posts along the main road at Newry and the main road into Londonderry and the main road in Enniskillen is going to represent a hard border which will somehow protect the EU from the incursion of goods that they don't want into the place, then people don't even understand what it means. Or do we mean by a hard border we have a minefield around the border with watchtowers so that no lorries can sneak across the 300 and so roads, or people can't build sheds in the middle of a field where you put goods in one side in Northern Ireland and the other come out the other side in the Irish Republic? It's a ridiculous suggestion. And yet this is thrown up at us all the time. And we heard the Honourable Lady for Bristol, who talked about the impact of this, and that the WTO would insist on this because the border and they had to protect trade. Well, the Irish Republic currently, of course, brings goods in from the rest of the world. Do they stop every container that comes in? No, they don't. Do they stop 10% of the containers? No, they don't. They don't even stop 1%. In fact, Gambia stops more trade coming through its borders than what the Irish Republic does. So this idea that somehow or other every good that comes into the EU via Northern Ireland and then into the Republic is going to have to be stopped, it doesn't even match with common day practice. And of course, when it comes to collecting taxes, 13,000 lorries a year cross the border carrying drink to other parts of the United Kingdom. There's duty to be collected on it. Not one of them stopped because the duty is collected electronically by pre-notification, by trusted trader status. So you can protect your border and meet with WTO rules without having all of the kind of paraphernalia that's just been suggested here tonight.
I wonder would the...
Oh, well, yes, certainly.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. He is quite right. There seem to be an awful lot of people who don't really understand what goes on now at the border. But could I just ask him to say, why could anyone tonight who supports Northern Ireland even think of voting against New Clause 37, which is a very clear putting out there that we want Northern Ireland to be treated the same way as the rest of the United Kingdom? If they do so, they're supporting, actually, the Republic of Ireland.
And I thank the member. And that's the whole point of New Clause 37. That first of all, it delivers on the promises that have been made by the government. It puts them into law. The second thing is it avoids the break-up of the United Kingdom and the kind of nonsense we're going to hear from the Scottish National Party that you can redefine the United Kingdom to have Northern Ireland and the UK excluded from it when it comes to trade issues. Of course, that's not, and indeed that would be against the Belfast Agreement, because the Belfast Agreement actually doesn't say a great deal about borders, but it does say something, and a lot, about the integrity of the United Kingdom, that it cannot be changed either by dictate from the EU or by demands from Dublin. It can only be changed with the will of the people of Northern Ireland. And yet the backstop arrangement which has been suggested is at the behest of the EU, which seems to disregard the most important part of the Belfast Agreement and has destabilised Northern Ireland as a result of that. I think it also yes, we'll give way, yes.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. He is, of course, right that the constitutional status of Northern Ireland has not been in dispute for a very long time and is undermined by the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. The only people that have started talking about the constitutional arrangement in Northern Ireland is as a result of BrExit. That is the only thing that has now started to trigger any discussion around the break-up of the United Kingdom, and I'm afraid his party has helped that process.
And that's the point I'm making, that this red herring has been thrown into the debate in order to try and persuade people like myself and people opposite to stay within the customs union and the single market. But it is a red herring. Because, as I've said, it is not essential to have a hard border to be able to protect trade between the United Kingdom outside the EU and the Irish Republic. Inside the EU, there are other methods which are currently done. We've got a fiscal border, a regulatory border, a currency border, and yet we don't need to have checks at the moment. Why would that change once we leave the EU? The third thing is this, that new Clause 37 actually strengthens the Prime Minister's hand. Because when she goes into negotiations, and there will still be this badgering from Barnier and co to insist that there has to be a different regime of regulation, of law and of EU interference in Northern Ireland, it strengthens her hand to be able to say the Parliament of the United Kingdom has said in law we will not and cannot change the status of Northern Ireland. We can't have separate custom arrangements for Northern Ireland. And the law says that. Of course, it also protects Northern Ireland from being cut off from its biggest market. The Irish Republic isn't our biggest market. The whole of the EU isn't our biggest market. Over 60% of what Northern Ireland produces comes to GB. Yeah. Ironically, if the government in Dublin was thinking with its head, it would also recognise that the Barnier formula for the border is one which is detrimental to them as well, because, of course, the Barnier formula would have a border down the Irish Sea, cutting the Irish Republic off from its biggest market. Over 50% of its agricultural products come here, and yet it is concerned about the paltry border which accounts for 1.6% of its trade. And, you know, people just fail to understand why this should be the case and why the government of the Republic should take that view. I believe that the Prime Minister does have an opportunity. This strengthens her hand, and in negotiations coming up to October, she still has got the opportunity to tell the EU, if you want our money, you have a fair deal. We'll prepare for a no deal if we can't get a good deal. And as far as trade is concerned, the balance of trade rests with us. If you want access to our markets, make sure we get access to your markets. That should be the approach. Get the handbag out, do a bit of swinging and get a good deal.
Honourable gentleman. Sir Bernard Jenkin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased to be following the honourable gentleman for East Antrim, who has put on record a great deal of fact and truth about the way the Northern Ireland issue has been treated in the negotiations and by the negotiating parties. What he missed out in his remarks was, of course, until the Varadkar government was elected, this wasn't an issue. The expectation was that there would be an invisible customs frontier in Northern Ireland, and that was confirmed by Bertie Ahern when he gave interviews on the subject. It was confirmed by the head of the Irish Customs Organisation when he gave evidence to the Irish Dáil. It was confirmed by John Thompson, the head of the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, when he gave evidence initially to the Treasury Select Committee. This was not an issue until it was made an issue. And we're being asked to believe two extraordinary things. One is that the Irish Republic itself might put infrastructure at the border of Northern Ireland, when the only reason the Irish Republic itself recognises that there is a frontier between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland is because they signed the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement. And the other thing we are being asked to do is, of course, when President Juncker appeared in front of the Dáil a few months ago and was pressed to give an assurance that he would not force the Republic to put infrastructure at the border, he more or less gave that assurance, and actually what was perfectly clear is that he was not going to say, we will force you to put infrastructure at the border. So it's clear that the EU is not going to force anyone to put infrastructure at the border. And finally, it is still the policy of the government that we might leave even without a withdrawal agreement on WTO terms. Under such circumstances, we are not going to put any infrastructure at the Irish border in Northern Ireland. And we will challenge the Irish Republic and the EU Commission not to do the same in the interests of peace in Northern Ireland. It's perfectly possible to manage a frontier-free customs frontier in Northern Ireland, and of course that is what will happen. And it is pure obstinacy on the part of the Commission that they will not negotiate with the United Kingdom a free trade agreement on the basis of making an agreement with the whole of the United Kingdom instead of excluding the Northern Ireland. I could wait to my honourable friend.
Very grateful. He's making some very good points. I certainly don't argue that we should be members of Customs Union, but the Freight Trade Association recently talked about a situation where a trailer full of 40 different consignments goes from Birmingham to Belfast and then goes into 40 different white vans in Belfast. How does he propose we would track and meet our responsibility to pay customs on the...
Immensely grateful. Can I encourage the right honourable gentleman to draw his remarks to a close? He's within his time, but there are a lot of other people wanting to speak, and I'm also being pressed by people who quite understandably want time. So if the honourable gentleman with his brilliant eloquence and pithiness can wrap up in a minute or two, that would be marvellous.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to answer that point, I think we have to be practical that there will be a change in the way people treat consignments because they're crossing a customs frontier. But actually, as the technology develops, it will be possible to track individual consignments or multiple consignments in trucks, and we've discussed this with the Customs and Revenue in this country, across customs frontiers as the technology develops. And in the end, in the future, looking ahead 10 or 20 years, the idea of customs frontiers existing between countries that trade tariff-free will become obsolete. It will become obsolete. So to hinge our entire Brexit policy on the question of not having customs declarations and customs frontiers is very last century, and we shouldn't be captured by that. Mr. Deputy Speaker, my remarks are directed primarily at Amendment 72, which I confess has turned out to be disappointingly uncontroversial. And I have to say it was the intention of ERG, a group of Conservative backbenchers, to table 4 amendments to test our understanding of government policy. 1 or 2 of those in the light of the Chequers Agreement and the White Paper, but to understand what it is the government was intending, because every single one of our amendments, we believe, reflects government policy, and I wouldn't imagine that the government would have accepted any of these amendments as calmly as they have if they don't reflect government policy. I do think that my right honourable friend, who seems to be becoming a Remainer again, judging from his article in the Evening Standard, oh yes, that's what he said. Oh, that's what he said. He said we'll have to rethink Brexit completely if we can't get a satisfactory arrangement. That's the direction he's going. I respect his view, but I think that throwing around insults like useless is not elevating the debate. The amendment that I'm proposing, Amendment 72, simply removes an extraordinarily powerful Henry VIII provision in this bill. That we should be signed up to a customs union with the European Union simply by order. And I thought what is source for the gander, in fact, the amendment that my right honourable learned friend for Beaconsfield applied to clause 9 of the European Withdrawal Bill, I thought what is source for the goose is source for the gander, and I don't suppose I shall hear him speaking against this particular amendment, because this puts Parliament back in control of the decision to join a customs union with the European Union, and that is what I think we should do. And I just end on this one point, Mr. Speaker. We've heard a lot about 40 MPs having an excessive amount of influence in this chamber. In fact, there are 17.4 million people who voted Leave in the referendum, and 70% of Conservative MPs represent Leave constituencies, 60% of Labour MPs represent Leave constituencies, and it would be bizarre if the House of Commons, which was elected predominantly on Leave manifestos, in the end puts roadblocks into leaving the European Union, and I don't believe it will.
Thank you. The limit will have to be reduced with immediate effect to 5 minutes. Helen Goodman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd wish to speak to New Clause 11 and against Amendment 73. Last week we had a debate in Westminster Hall, and the Minister, who is back in his place, advised me that everything would become clear when the white paper was published. I'm afraid as I stand here, 70 minutes before we're going to vote, government policy is still not quite clear, and I'm going to ask the Minister in the course of my remarks a few questions in the hope that we might in fact get some clarification from the Minister, because I'm interested in the interrelationship between the bill and the white paper which was published last week. Now, contrary to what some honourable and right honourable members wish to say, the common market, which is the customs union, is fantastically popular with the public. Whenever I ask my constituents, what do you dislike about Europe? They say, being bossed around and the immigration. When I say, what do you like? They say, oh, we love the common market. Well, of course, the common market is the customs union. And when I talk to industrialists, what they want, in the words of Glaxo, which employs 1,000 people in my constituency, is no disruption. In the case of PPG, which is a supplier to Airbus, they want a common rule book. And when I spoke this morning to the North East Chamber of Commerce, they said that 90% of members of the North East Chamber of Commerce want to stay in the customs union. Well, we know, legally speaking, that's not possible, so we have to have a new one, but which will give them the exact same benefits. However, what I'm not clear about is whether or not the bill facilitates the customs approach which is set out in the white paper, and which of the amendments from the government have made changes to the bill which will enable them to undertake the facilitated customs arrangement which they have described here. And nor am I clear, and I hope very much that the Minister will be able to explain this when he comes to wind up at the end of the debate, and I'm sure he will now, whether or not the government's proposed acceptance of amendments from the ERG means that they are abandoning as their opening position the facilitated customs arrangement, or whether they are still holding to it. If they are still holding to it, I would suggest that it's not wholly practical. It will need a tracking system so that when people import goods, they know where their final use is going to be. This is a whole new bureaucratic system. It means that people who import are going to have information along the supply chain, which at the moment is of no concern to them. I know that the white paper says there's going to be a formula so that we can just follow the proportions of the past year. But what about if things change from one year to another? Then people are going to have to make their rebates on the basis of new, fresh information in real time. It sounds very much as if not only are we going to have VAT, we're going to have VAT Mark II. And looking at the white paper, paragraph 20 on page 18, it says this could include looking to make it easier to allow traders to lodge information. This could include exploring how machine learning and AI could allow traders. It could include exploring how allowing data sharing across borders would work. It could include rather a lot of things, and I can only imagine officials saying to ministers when they were drafting this does seem to involve rather a lot of imagination. It does not seem to be bottomed out, and that is why I would much prefer it if we could go along the path set out by my right honourable friends on the front bench of new clause 11, because what is being proposed will be horrendously bureaucratic and an open invitation to smuggling.
Thank you. Mr Dominic Grieve.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There's one matter on which I agree with my right honourable friend for Horton, Price and Houghton, and that is that this piece of legislation is needed if we're leaving the EU. That's the first basic point that needs to be made in considering the report stage of this bill. then one has to consider why the report stage becomes so controversial. And the difficulty, Mr. Speaker, is that throughout the whole of this process of Brexit, we are collectively going through an exercise both in deception and self-deception about the implications of leaving the European Union and the sort of relationship we may have thereafter. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has produced a white paper. It's far from perfect. It too continues with some of those obfuscations, I have to say. Just to give an example, and I know it's irritated many of my right honourable and honourable friends on this side of the House, it talks about the Common Rule Book and then says, don't worry, we will be escaping the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. Well, we may escape its jurisdiction, but I'm the first to accept that the reality is that we are going to be bound by its jurisprudence without any ability of influencing how that jurisprudence develops. That is one of the costs that we are paying as a result of deciding to leave. And in exactly the same way, there are other costs that come from leaving and which we tend to brush under the carpet, including the economic costs which are going to come to this country. And if we're going to make rational choices, we need to avoid continuing with exercises in self-deception. The reason why I think it right to support the Prime Minister in the White Paper is that despite all the difficulties she's had, this represents the first sensible document to found a proper negotiation. And I wish her well in it, even if I have criticisms about it, worry about the absence of services and the common market for that, and worry about some other aspects of it. But nevertheless, it's well-intentioned. And then I look at the 4 amendments tabled by some of my honourable friends, 36, 37, 72 and 73, to this bill. The first thing to be said about them is that one of them, the one about Northern Ireland, correctly identifies an obfuscation that the government has been practising for a considerable period of time. We and the European Commission are talking a different language when it comes to the backstop. And I have no difficulty emphasising the fact that no Parliament of the United Kingdom is ever going to support a backstop which simply goes for Northern Ireland on its own. So I don't have a difficulty with that. But then I turn to 36 and 73. The first thing which strikes me about them is that they are directly designed to undermine the White Paper. And the second point about them is that when you actually look at them, they don't do the job. They are inadequately drafted. And so the second obfuscation is that the government has accepted amendments which it knows cannot do what the intention is. Shocking. And not only that, they've told my honourable and right honourable friends that, and they've decided not to say, oh, then in those circumstances we withdraw the amendment, to persist with it because it's just an exercise in bullying. And it is not my job as a Member of Parliament to put on the statute book clauses in bills which are inadequate, incomprehensible, and on top of that seek to undermine the government, and that's why I describe them as entirely malevolent. And for that reason, I shall be voting against both of them this evening.
Thank you. Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to new clause 1, 11 and 12. And I really want to speak very much in support of a customs union. I have to say just how surprised I was to hear the former minister and now member, or the member for Halton, Price and Howden, in the way he was describing the border at Detroit and Ontario, which I was lucky enough to go to back in February with fellow members of the International Trade Select Committee. And I think I witnessed something slightly different to what he did. And that was, I did see friction, even on a very cold, icy day. There was considerable time spent there at the border, and they do have an X-ray building for pantechnicons, and they do take vehicles out of the queues to examine on a very frequent basis. It is not as simple as I think he was suggesting. And added to that, perhaps just to underline, and perhaps he was not so aware, is that Canada is having to invest in a second bridge across the river between Ontario and Detroit to safeguard their business because of the delays that they're actually suffering. So I would agree with the member for Rushcliffe for whom I have a huge amount of respect. And when he was describing the great fear, really, of what is we're facing here, in what seems to be an apparent pursuit of ideological goals or indeed personal ambition on the part of certain individuals. Importantly, and I would say that for many months now, almost a year, I have been trying to encourage businesses, the likes of Jaguar Land Rover in my constituency and others, to speak out. Yep. And businesses are terrified of doing that. They are terrified because they fear incurring the wrath of the public. They do not see it as their responsibility. They see it as at the part of ourselves as elected representatives to do that. But they have felt necessary in recent weeks. And of course we've heard from Airbus, we've heard from Jaguar Land Rover. And when they speak softly, but we should be listening. And the public should be listening because they speak so rarely. And that is why it is so important. It is far more critical that we listen to the likes of Jaguar Land Rover or BMW Mini than, dare I say, the member for Uxbridge. And I think the public are beginning to see that. And I think the public now are recognising that amongst all the debate that goes on in here, there is beginning to become some clarity coming from those voices. For over 2 years, businesses have waited for the government to give some sort of direction against this uncertainty that they face. And I think it's that, really, that is the threat for them. I was interested to hear the points being made by the Honourable Member for Harwich and North Essex, and I respect him and indeed his experience. But I think it's the disruption and uncertainty that is of greatest concern to businesses. And they will review their options, and they have been for the last 24 months. And irrespective of where we end up in the coming weeks, they are already making their decisions. They are already taking options abroad for future investment. Anything that makes life difficult for business, which adds cost, which adds time, makes them review those proposals and those options and what is in their best interest. And looking at the automotive industry and many others, the businesses are not so obviously viable to incur the costs of WTO additional tariffs. They will review that 10%, that 4.5%, and cost it in and think, is it really best for us to stay in the UK?
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will indeed, sir.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and he speaks with great experience on these matters. Would he agree with me that the costs he's just talking about tariffs, rules of origin, which we've discussed earlier, customs declarations, may for small businesses be a cost that they cannot accommodate, and maybe more than the profit they're making on the goods that they're selling at the moment. So it is the small and medium-sized enterprises that would be most adversely affected by the argument made by some opposite that we should contemplate no deal with equanimity.
I thank my honourable friend, and he is quite right, that for SMEs, particularly in the component supply chain, that they are the most vulnerable to these sorts of changes, and they are the ones that will see the likelihood of either losing business elsewhere or having to move abroad as necessary. And I can give absolute examples of where that has already taken place. The honourable member and learned member for Rushcliffe, when he was describing the customs union, is apparently some sort of problem to us, that somehow it's holding us back. Of course, he's quite right. It has not been. When you look at the likes of Germany, who have 10 times our exports to China, they're in the customs union. It's not been to their disadvantage. And as he said, over the last 10 years, we have witnessed the most phenomenal explosion and success of the automotive industry in this country, where it has grown by over 50% in that period after 20 years of relative stagnation. And I would just say, in summing up, that when it is rare for businesses to speak out, we should really listen. They do not intervene lightly in the politics of this country or elsewhere. So for me, the preservation of a true customs union is critical to safeguard business and future investment in this country, and that is why I'll be supporting the new clauses 1, 11 and 12.
Thank you. Justine Greening.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I should say that I recognise the importance of this bill and why it's necessary if we're leaving the European Union. But I think many of the amendments that we have been debating here this evening reflect the fact that, regrettably, we have now had the White Paper published, and it simply doesn't represent that clear-cut, deliverable strategy that I believe our country needs. It is, Mr. Speaker, a fudge. As the Honourable Member for Chelsea and Fulham set out, if you're a Remainer, you question why we are accepting so many rules whilst forfeiting the right to be sat round the table where they're decided. And of course, I know that many of my colleagues in this place who campaign strongly for leave are equally unhappy and believe, I believe with some merit, that people who voted for leave in the EU referendum are simply not getting the kind of Brexit that they feel gives our country the clean break that it needs if it's going to be successful. Now, I spent a long time in business before I went into this place, and I know that if you're going to have a successful strategy, it needs to be a clear-cut one that everyone can get behind. And I may not agree with some of my colleagues about what that best strategy is. I may not want to leave on WTO rules, but in the context of this white paper, I think it is important for this House to listen to colleagues, perhaps none more so than my right honourable friend, the member for Halton, Price and Howden, who are respected on this issue and has, of course, in his case, been right at the forefront of this deal as it's been developing for the past 2 years. Indeed, of course, also alongside, I think we'd all describe him, the ever-resourceful member for High Wycombe. I think both took principled decisions to leave the government that I respect. I know from my own personal circumstances that those are not easy decisions, but I also, in their case, fully understood why they did this. And it may be that there are, in practice, 3 practical options for our country's path forward, but I believe that in reality there are only 2 clear strategies, and there are only 2 paths for us to actually achieve having a successful Britain in the long term. And of course both do have pros and cons, and I think it's important that whilst there are passionate views held on all sides of this House, that we debate them as far as we can in a measured way. But the PM now presents us with a third way, a compromise, a pathway between the 2, and I understand the desire of the government to achieve compromise, but I believe genuinely that the White Paper demonstrates that in reality the choice we have is either one approach or the other. And I think it's vital to now have a realistic, clear-cut strategy which can actually be delivered. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that if you have a plan that you can't deliver, then it's not a plan. And I think this White Paper regrettably attempts to ride 2 horses, and that never works. And it's on that basis that I've said this deal is the worst of all worlds, and I think it is a deal that in the end will please no one and is probably the worst outcome we can get. It keeps nobody happy at all. And whether you take my arguments or whether you take the arguments of, for example, my right honourable friend, the member for Witham, which we heard earlier, I think both paths, as I've said, have got pros and cons, but both represent the clear routes forward that are actually genuine strategies for our country. Now, we know about those options. My concern, Mr. Speaker, is that this place has reached stalemate, and as this debate exemplifies, there are still deep divisions in terms of people's views, and again, I think we understand why, but my view now is that because of the stalemate in this place, it's time for the British public to have the final say on these clear approaches that we face ahead of us. On Brexit, we absolutely have to settle this now if we are going to move beyond Brexit and to get onto the other vital issues facing our country, whether housing, whether lack of social mobility, or whether social care and the rest of that. That's what we should be aiming to do. I don't believe we should have a compromise as a strategy that will simply have to be reopened later and renegotiated later. I've reached my conclusion on the Chequers deal. I know colleagues and members will look more closely over the coming days, but I leave members to think on these words. Standing in the middle of the road is very dangerous. You get knocked down by the traffic from both directions.
Thank you. Several members, all on the same side, wish to speak. I'm going to suggest now the limit is reduced to 4 minutes, but it is not obligatory to consume all 4. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Putney, for what I thought was a remarkably gracious speech in a quite fevered atmosphere to put both sides of the case so generously and kindly. But I want to speak to the 4 amendments that I have supported and in most cases put my name to. These are broadly in line with government policy, which is why the government has accepted them. Amendment 72 on the Northern Ireland question. It is clearly government policy that Northern Ireland should not be removed from the rest of the United Kingdom, and I think to put that in legislation is beneficial. Number 72 was the Henry VIII clause. New clause 37 is the Irish border. The Henry VIII clause, I agree with my right honourable learned friend, the member for Beaconsfield, or Beaconsfield as Benjamin Disraeli always pronounced it, that we should not have Henry VIII clauses if we can possibly avoid them. They're not good legislative practice, and the fewer Henry VIII clauses, the better. I will confess I would have supported him in earlier bills had I not thought by so doing I would have caused suspicion on the other side of the European debate, and people would wonder what on earth I was up to. But I'm very pleased that Henry VIII clauses are becoming less popular in this House. Amendment 73 has been a topic of discussion here on the no EU VAT regime. This is actually government policy. It was set out by the right honourable, my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, on the Andrew Marr programme, to say that once we were leaving the European Union, we would not be part of its EU VAT regime. And the difference here is between acquisition VAT and import VAT. Import VAT is the normal way we charge VAT on third countries outside the European Union, whereas acquisition VAT is an EU system. And therefore, if we are leaving, it makes absolute sense to be out of this, and it fits in with what the government has said. Of course I give way.
I don't quite see how the honourable gentleman can say this is compatible with the government's policy when the Chequers white paper, which after all was only on Thursday, says, quote, to ensure that new declarations and border checks between the UK and the EU do not need to be introduced for VAT and excise purposes, the UK proposes the application of common cross-border processes and procedures for VAT and excise. How is he in any way compatible with government policy?
Honourable gentleman, I can merely appeal to how this was set out by my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, who said we would not be part of the EU's VAT regime. VAT is not collected at the border. It is collected by statements from people who are importing and send in the returns in relation to their VAT, and that this would enforce a uniform system across all our VAT collections. So that is the purpose of that. And if a government minister states its government policy, that's quite good enough for me, and if it's government policy, to have it in law seems to be quite sensible, and therefore not to have a clause that is contradictory to government policy simply flows from that. But I want to focus on new clause number 36, because that has been the one that has attracted the most controversy in this debate. The importance of new clause 36 is that it would actually allow the government to run its trade policy. Trade remedies were mentioned by my right honourable friend, the member for Chelsea and Fulham. Trade remedies would not be possible if this clause were not implemented, because it would simply allow for goods to be imported into the UK via other member states currently of the European Union and not subject to any anti-dumping measures that we may have taken. Honourable and right honourable members may be aware that in 2016 we bought £42 billion worth of imports from Holland and £26 billion worth of imports from Belgium. Now, this is not entirely clogs and chocolates. It is, in fact, re-imports from goods that have come through the major ports in the Low Countries through to the United Kingdom. It is a major gateway of EU goods, or goods into the EU that then come to the UK. If we have our own trade policy, we must be able to ensure that those are subject to our duties, both in terms of revenue collection and protection, but also in terms of anti-dumping measures if we chose to take them. Otherwise, we would find we were simply following anti-dumping measures implemented by the European Union and had no independent policy. But the point of reciprocity also seems to me to be fair, that if we are to say to the European Union, we will collect your taxes, we will remit them to you, that is a large amount of money potentially that we will be sending to the European Union, giving up all the duties that would fall through to us that would be coming from goods entering the European Union, 27 remaining member states. Well, should we really be affording to do that? What is happening to that revenue? And in terms of our independent trade policy, not if we want anti-dumping measures, but what if we want to lower prices?
I think now 3 minutes will suffice. Jonathan Jalogly.
Mr. Speaker, and let me just say in relation to the tabling of the ERG amendments for debate today, to my mind, they're clearly aimed at restricting the ability of the government to negotiate, if indeed they're compatible with the White Paper at all, a White Paper which I should say I support. Amendment 73 and New Clause 36 certainly fall into this category and have been tabled, I would say, by those who wish to create such difficulties and red lines that we're forced to a hard Brexit, ostensibly by default yet secretly by design, and they will not have my support later on today. But what I want to do today, Mr. Speaker, is to address the claims of those who say that we don't want the FCA or indeed a customs union because we can't then strike our own trade deals. And I note that the government are maintaining that we should be able to separate goods from services, whilst others caution against this because goods and services are often so intrinsically linked that this would be unrealistic. I wait to see the EU's position on this. However, on the central issue of negotiating our own FTAs, I think we need to question the benefits that so many seem to be taking for granted. Firstly, we need to appreciate that the Department of Trade is currently acting as something as a Jekyll and Hyde on this issue. On the one hand, the Secretary of State is talking about bravely striding around the world seeking new FTAs with countries like the US and China, but on the other hand, he's pleading with the EU and about 70 third-party countries to roll over the existing 40 or so FTAs that the EU now has with them. So for over one-third of the world's countries, Brexit represents the chance at best to get the same deal as the EU. Actually, from the look of things, we may yet get a worse deal in some cases as those third countries start evaluating the decreased advantage of dealing with 50 million people rather than 500 million people. Secondly, there's very little evidence that business sees any advantage of customs differentiation, in fact quite the opposite. The vast majority see advantages in our customs and negotiating position emanating from the power of the huge trading bloc represented by the EU, and will wish in any event to stick closely as possible to whatever trading position the EU takes. Thirdly, world trade is much more interlinked and complex than most people discuss. For instance, some of the existing trade agreements that we want to roll over, such as Canada and South Korea, feature most favoured nation clauses. So, for instance, if we agree on an FTA with the USA that offers better terms than we've agreed with Canada, then Canada would need to be offered the same deal. So the advantages of being outside of the customs union are much reduced in any event, and the talk of becoming some kind of colony or vassal state in this context is therefore ridiculous. Fourthly, we live in a world of trading blocs where size really does matter, and rather than discussing a trade deal at the moment with the US, we've actually become caught up in a trade battle. And again, if we were in a customs union, we would have more cover. And finally, I would point out that in having negotiations on new FTAs, this is a long and arduous business. The average is 7 years, and Canada took 15 years. Bargaining is tough and based on potential market clout. And this goes back to the possibility of US chlorinated chickens and so forth. But we need
to the honourable gentleman, to whom I can always listen at length, but we must move on. Mr. Kevin Hollinrake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I speak against, if I may, New Clause 1, so tabled by my right honourable friend for Broxtowe, on the basis that, amongst the many points my constituents have made to me over the last few weeks, is why it is that this House cannot work together on Brexit. And I suppose the simple conclusion you must draw is that our biggest challenge and what divides us most is not the acceptance of the result of the referendum on the 23rd of June, but its practical interpretation as the basis for our future relationship with the European Union. Parliament is bound by our promise on Brexit, also perhaps needs to accept some key principles which reflect the promises that were made during the referendum campaign. Where better for these principles perhaps to look than the voice, the official body that argued for Brexit in terms of that was Vote Leave, who said on trade the Vote Leave manifesto was clear. We take back the power to make our own trade deals. So it is quite clear that we must not remain part, on that basis, of a customs union, as this prevents us from directly negotiating and implementing trade deals. Strange, therefore, that this seems to be Labour Party policy, which goes right against that clear mandate the people gave us. But there were other commitments in that Vote Leave manifesto. For example, one thing that won't change is our ability to trade freely with Europe. It is fair on that basis to assume to most businesses and the jobs of those people who rely on those businesses that nothing will change. Of course, honourable members have made the point that other countries manage to trade just-in-time supply chains when they have a customs border, but most countries have not been part of a trading environment for 44 years where they have not carried the burden of those complexities. And of course, we know from Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, businesses have a choice to station themselves here or move those jobs into other parts of the European Union because extra costs will ensue if they don't. Costs for customs checks and costs for checks on standards. So I believe, therefore, Mr. Speaker, that it is not consistent with the mandate that people gave us that we do stay part of a customs union, but I do believe the White Paper, as articulated by the Prime Minister, does deal with our obligation to leave the European Union, but also to minimise costs, minimise those costs of comparative advantage. The White Paper does this, and in my view, the House should support it.
2 minutes is preferable to 3. Charlie Elphick.
Speaker, in the referendum campaign, my constituents were told by the Home Office that the jungle would move from Calais to Dover. And they were told by the former Prime Minister there'd be queues of lorries on the way to Dover and gridlock, a mantra taken up by the party opposite. And they were then told by the Treasury that they would lose their job and their homes to boot in a calamitous disaster. But despite that level of fear, they believed in the opportunity that lay before them. 2/3 voted to leave the European Union. And why is that? Because they believed in the kind of opportunities and the kind of Britain that we can build. They believed in better. They believed in the future. They believed in our sense of nation and our sense of independence and the kind of country that we could build independent out in the wide world. And I think it's really important to remember that, because change doesn't come easily. It takes political courage. And our voters, the electorate out there, have shown more courage than far too many members in this House who fear change, who fear to grasp those opportunities, who fear to grasp what the world offers. And our voters understand better the need for that courage, because they can look at the figures and see that the European Union has been in relative decline in the last few decades, going from 30% of GDP to just 15% of GDP. I know the spokesman for Brussels, the member for Carl-Charlton, doesn't like those figures, but they are true. And they know that 90% of future economic growth in the world is coming from outside the European Union. And that is why it is so important that we believe in better and back our constituents and make a success of Britain out in the world, a global Britain.
Thank you. Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are leaving the EU, and that means we need to have a new relationship with the single market and customs union. We cannot carry on as we were before. But Leave voters were also told time and time again that trade will continue, and having customs clarity is important to that trade. There are some myths going about, and I want to dispel them. First of all, zero tariff regimes is not the same as no tariff regime. No tariff regime, which we have now, means no customs declaration, no rules of origin. Zero tariff means both. And that is why I'm glad that the White Paper says we will have no customs declarations, no rules of origin. Myth 2, you do not need to be inside a customs union to resolve the rules of origin issue. That can be done via the PEM Convention. Myth 3, being in a single rule book on goods does not stop you from doing trade deals with other parts of the world. Just look at Switzerland. Myth 3, trading on WTO rules means there will have to be a goods border in Ireland. Otherwise, the UK will be breaching our agreements with other trading partners, as will the EU. Myth 5, just-in-time delivery that we have with goods coming from China that take 4 weeks at sea is not the same as just-in-time delivery across the Channel. I agree with some of the amendments tonight. The new clause 37 for no hard border in the Irish Sea makes sense. The new amendment 72 also makes sense. But I'm concerned about the amendment 73. I don't like the EU VAT regime, but we do need more clarity on that. And the new clause 36, I agree we need a balanced approach on tax collection, but it is very unclear how this is worded, and I don't understand how the reciprocity word works in a legal framework when it's country to country versus us to EU. So it needs a much more clear legal basis. Thank you.
There is a minute. Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will particularly just wanted to focus really on trade remedies in this bill, and it's particularly important for the ceramics sector in my constituency. So I'm absolutely delighted that the government has listened to the arguments that I've been making over the last year to secure those clarifying amendments on trade remedies that will critically deliver the right Brexit for the ceramics sector and for wider manufacturing industries, and most importantly for the workforce and voters of Stoke-on-Trent. And there are several amendments that have been put forward by this government which will have critical importance, and particularly I was very pleased to have the written question answered as well last week that confirmed around establishing normal value, which is so important to resist dumping of ceramic products from China, where there are significant state subsidisation going on, particularly in the ceramics industry, that does threaten British industry. So I'm pleased that the government has listened to those arguments and has taken action with the amendments put forward.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, given that I think there may not be a third reading, I'm going to just start very briefly with a couple of thank yous. I'd like to thank Scott Taylor, one of our researchers, and I'd also like to thank the work of the Public Bill Office, particularly Colin Lee and Gail Poulton, who have been absolutely excellent in their support of all of us who have been through the course of the bill. Mr. Speaker, I just want to talk briefly about the kind of history of the bill and how we've come to get here. We had the committee stage earlier this year. Just at the end of committee stage, as soon as it had finished, on a Saturday morning, almost out of the blue, the UK government announced that it wouldn't be going into a customs union. It clearly didn't think it through. It brought it forward at the most stupid time, because given that we'd just done all of the debating on the committee stage, it was totally ill thought out. Yep. And then, Mr. Speaker, we had the Chequers Agreement on the 6th of July. Then we had the White Paper on the 12th of July, which you will note was the day after the amendments to this bill, to this remaining stages, had to come in. So we all had to put in our amendments before we had actually seen the White Paper. I thank the Minister for coming to Westminster Hall and giving us some level of reassurance, but pretty much all the reassurance he could give was, please look at the White Paper that is coming out on Thursday. So it has been just really difficult to prepare for this. It has been really difficult to write this speech, Mr. Speaker. Trying to game exactly what is going to happen tonight, I'm still not clear. Mr. Speaker, there is too many factions in this House. We have the UK government. We have got the Conservative Remainers, we've got the ERG, we've got the DUP, we've got the Labour Leavers, the Labour Remainers and the Labour Front Bench. Mr. Speaker, the UK government will not support things that have been put forward by anybody who supports Remain. The Labour Front Bench will not will not support anything that's been put forward by the Conservative Remainers. The ERG won't support anything that's put forward by anybody except themselves. The DUP will support whatever the UK government tells them to on the basis that they're being paid to do so. Mr. Speaker, it is a complete shambles. This trying to do anything sensible in this House is incredibly, incredibly difficult. Given that we know that within this House, within the MPs, there is a majority for a customs union, Mr. Speaker. Despite that, we're going to end up in the situation where the ERG, who believe in the most polar opposite suggestion to a customs union, are having their amendments accepted, and the rest of us who put forward anything vaguely sensible are not having our amendments accepted. Mr. Speaker, this is not about sovereignty. This is certainly not about sovereignty for the people. It's not about sovereignty for Parliament. It's about sovereignty for a very small group of elite Tories who want to have their say and who the government are letting have their say. I could not be more angry about the fact that these amendments are apparently going to be accepted. And I just want to not totally direct all of my ire at the UK government front bench. The Labour front bench needs to be absolutely clear what their position is. They need to be clear. They need to be clear that they will support the softest possible Brexit. If they are talking about a jobs-first Brexit, they need to recognise the benefits of the customs union and the single market. And they have the opportunity to do that tonight. They have the opportunity to support some of the amendments that have been put forward by those people that support a soft Brexit. Mr. Speaker, the amendments that are on the order paper, I and the SNP do not support fully a number of the amendments that we would plan to vote for tonight. This is on the basis that our position is Scotland voted to remain in the EU, so we would quite like to remain in the EU. Scotland supports remaining in the single market and the customs union. The SNP will support anything that keeps us in the single market and the customs union. In the absence of those options being on the table, Mr. Speaker, we will do what we can in order to protect the economic and cultural interests of the whole of the United Kingdom. We will do that, even though some of the amendments are not brilliant. We will vote for anything that makes Brexit slightly softer than the Brexit that is being proposed. So that's why I needed to make that clear, Mr. Speaker, that just because we support an amendment here doesn't mean it's a preferred option. It just means it's not quite as bad as some of the other options that are. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear that I'm moving new clause 16 in the name of myself and in the name of my colleagues, and I'd also like to speak in favour of the other amendments that we have on the order paper. The SNP position, as I said, is crystal clear. The UK government position is not. I do want to welcome some of the clarity that is given in the Chequers paper, the white paper that was published after Chequers. I have major concerns about some of it, though. It mentions specifically a trusted trader scheme. The trusted trader scheme, the AEO scheme that there is, I have raised concern after concern about the AEO scheme. I am not the only one. Organisations like the British Chambers of Commerce have raised concerns with the AEO scheme. If there is to be an expanded trusted trader scheme, it needs to actually work. It needs to be applicable to small businesses, and businesses need to be able to access that scheme. We are now at the stage that businesses should know what those schemes are. If the government is going to bring them forward, it needs to do so as quickly as it possibly can, so that businesses can be clear on what basis they will be trading in the future. I think that's really important. I'm pleased to see that diagonal accumulation has been recognised in the Chequers Agreement. I have been talking about diagonal accumulation for some time, and I'm really glad that that has been recognised and that we will have a situation where possibly we will still be able to export cars to South Korea, because that's really quite important for our car industry. So I'm pleased that the government is now being made clear that they are pursuing that. On the issue of PGIs, protected geographical indicators, that's also mentioned in the Chequers paper, I'm slightly concerned about the way that the government is going in relation to this. It would be very good to have more information around that. A PGI scheme that only applies to the UK and doesn't recognise EU PGIs is a bit of a problem. So we need to have more clarity from the UK government on how they intend the PGI scheme to work. I know there's a negotiation, but if we could have their point of view first on that, that would be very useful in going forward. I want to briefly mention some of the other meat that there is in the customs bill as it is. I want to talk about something that the British Retail Consortium brought to us. The British Retail Consortium kind of encapsulated some of the issues with this bill very, very neatly. They said there are not yet agreements on security, transit, haulage, VAT and people, that we need mutual recognition on veterinary health and other checks with the EU, and I think it seems that the government is pursuing some of this, so that is good news. They need investment in IT systems to deliver the customs declaration system. Again, I am still not convinced that this will come through in time. If the Government Minister could give reassurance that this will come through, I would very much appreciate it. We need coordination between agencies at ports and borders and investment in capacity and staff at ports. Both of those things the UK Government has done not enough on. They have not put in the extra resource into ports. They have not told ports how they will be administering these things in the future. If ports are going to have to massively increase the number of staff that they have, then they need to know now how they're going to do that. And just on the queuing thing, a 2-minute delay at Dover will create a 17-mile queue. 2-minute delay causes a 17-mile queue. So it's not like Operation Stack is something that will just happen as normal. This will not be Operation Stack. This will be an incredibly large version of Operation Stack, and Operation Stack was bad enough. They've also mentioned the issue about AEOs, particularly in relation to SMEs. All of those things are still issues with this bill and are still concerns that I will be, if we have a debate at third reading, that I will be raising at third reading, because I do not believe that this bill is fit for purpose as it is. I specifically want to talk about the new clauses from the ERG. If the UK Government is minded to accept them, then we have a very, very severe problem, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, new clause 36, new clause 37, Amendment 72 and Amendment 73. I've got major issues with all of them. New clause 36, in relation to reciprocity. It says, on page 13 of the Chequers Agreement, at the core of the UK's proposal is the establishment by the UK and the EU of a free trade area for goods. It then goes on to make clear on page 17 that the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK's tariffs and trade policy at its border for goods intended for the UK. This amendment directly contradicts that.
Drags a coach and horses.
What is the point in having a white paper released on a Thursday if the government's going to ignore it on Monday? I don't understand how we can be in this position. How can businesses know where we're going if the government doesn't even know where it's going? And for the government to be accepting amendments by a group of around 14, who knows how many of them there are, ERG members, in order to get a hard Brexit, is absolutely ridiculous. What we need, if there's going to be a Brexit, we need a Brexit that does what the Labour Party are suggesting that it should do, is protect jobs. We need the Labour Party to support a Brexit that protects jobs as well, not just us. Mr. Speaker, this bill is a mess. It doesn't do what it set out to do in the first place, which was replicate the UCC. It doesn't now do what the Chequers Agreement said it would do on Friday, and we need everybody in the House, from all of those various factions that I mentioned earlier, to get behind proposals that actually protect jobs, proposals that actually protect the sovereignty of the people and not just the sovereignty of an elite few.
Mr. Peter Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was reading the white paper on the train home on Thursday afternoon, even if only out of a sense of morbid curiosity. And that curiosity, when today's Brexit, the capitulation today by the Prime Minister of the Brexiteers, it turned to a sense of the macabre. So we had to begin with the woman in the bunker with the blacked out windows said we are outward facing, are we? This is from a Prime Minister who invented the hostile environment for the Windrush generation, for disabled people claiming their rightful benefits, and whose government has been on the wrong side of the law more times than Arthur Daly. She went on to state we have a dynamic, innovative economy. Do we? Our economy is 35% less productive than the German economy. We invest less and we have the most regionally imbalanced economy in Europe. Growth is sluggish, inflation stubborn, and on it goes. It gets more surreal. She says we live by common values of openness and tolerance for others and the rule of law. Really? Really, the only thing the party opposite are open to and tolerant of is big fat donations from Russian oligarchs. But here is where it gets really interesting, Mr. Speaker. When the Prime Minister speaks about sticking to our principles, one has to wonder which principles the Prime Minister is referring to. The ones she held yesterday that are enshrined in the White Paper, or those that she has this afternoon, which tear up the White Paper. It tears us to shreds. Perhaps the Minister can enlighten us on this one. She wanted to deliver an ambition to, once and for all, strengthen our communities, our union, our democracy, our place in the world. So let's take those claims once by one. Our communities have been ripped apart by austerity. Our union is in danger from ministers out out of touch with the needs of any nations and afraid to move away from the desk in case someone else takes it. Our democracy is threatened by swathes of Henry VIII powers, and our place in the world is a laughingstock due to her supine sycophancy of Donald Trump, who humiliated her. Mr. Speaker, this white paper, what's left of it, that is, all came from the pen of a Prime Minister obsessed with rather silly soundbites, such as Labour's magic money tree, until she wanted a magic money tree of her own to bribe the DUP. That phrase was quickly ditched. What about the infamous strong and stable mantra? That turned out to be more like a strong and stable smell of panic during the election. That was ditched as well. And finally, Mr. Speaker, it seems that this white paper has also been ditched. As for Northern Ireland, I present, Mr. Speaker, the buffer zone, a 10-mile wide area along the entire boundary between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Under the trading rules of the EU, to be operational, this buffer would have to be policed on both sides of the 10-mile divide. Mr. Speaker, did we really spend decades trying to get rid of divides in Northern Ireland only to resurrect them? I think not. As for the facilitated custom arrangement, well, we're not clear what constituted a partnership about this arrangement, which effectively left the UK customs officials working to maintain the customs union that we're no longer a part of. Second, regardless of who is responsible for managing the duties, it remains unclear how this FCA would be frictionless. Presumably the final destination of goods would have to be queried as they enter the UK. This will slow down the passage of goods across our borders, and it will prevent intricate supply chains from functioning properly. It will lead to waste, uncertainty and expense for business. It will lead to higher prices for consumers, and it will lead to job losses and production moving abroad, the point that the Right Honourable Lady for Broxtowe mentioned, and the comments from the Right Honourable Member for Gainsborough in that regard were absolutely unconscionable. And what about the UK border? Does the Minister expect checks to be in place to ensure that goods which claim the UK was their final destination are not diverted into the UK, wanting the EU once they arrive? Presumably we would need to have customs checks and controls between the EU and UK to reconcile goods to documents when, for example, UK anti-dumping duties exceed those applicable on import duties. So can the Minister clarify any of that? Can the Minister tell us how the many trusted traders, a use of the word by the Tories, trusted, that's a laugh, isn't it, are currently registered with the government schemes, and how many they believe will be registered by the end of the transition period? Now, coming to new clause 11. Of course, all this can be avoided, Mr. Speaker, if the House choose to support Labour's clear and pragmatic solution to the issues of frictionless trade within the EU and preventing a hard border in Northern Ireland. These are contained in the amendment we have tabled in this bill. New Clause 11 presents Labour's practical solution to the problems which have confounded the party opposite. In this new clause, we call on the government to negotiate a new customs union with the European Union in place for when we leave the current customs union at the end of the transition period. This is the only way to ensure that we can have frictionless trade with our largest trading partner and help keep no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. It's what business needs, it's what producers want, and it would most benefit the public. I encourage members from across the House, even the Chancellor is muttering away there, to support our new Clause 11, which will ensure that the government negotiates a settlement which puts both the British economy and the Good Friday Agreement first. And what we will not countenance is new Clause 36 and Amendment 37. We're not having it. As for trade remedies, Mr. Speaker, there is no greater evidence of the need for robust trade remedies than the current global climate. As we are witnessing the familiarities and old certainties of free trade being laid waste to by the US President, who is committed to imposing protectionist tariffs on the rest of the world. A US President who rebuffs diplomacy daily in favour of angry tweets at night, who favours confrontation over cooperation and is willing to exchange open markets for the very real threat of trade wars. Mr. Speaker, in this uncertain climate, in this uncertain climate, it makes it all the more important that the government adopts trade remedies, more important than ever. It's no exaggeration to say that without robust trade remedies, the UK faces the spectre of whole sections of our economy being wiped out and destroyed by punitive tariffs and undercut by state-sponsored dumping. The reality is that when countries engage in trade wars or trading one protectionist tariff for another, at risk are the very jobs and industries that communities across this country rely on. And as we pointed out at the second reading in the Public Bill Committee, the remedies proposed in this bill remain pitiful to say the least. They are far weaker than the remedies currently in place at EU level and will leave the UK worse off than most developed trading nations. While there is a clear case for assessing the economic impact of trade remedies on key sectors of the economy and exports, the establishment of an undefined public interest test is more worrying. In its current format, the Secretary of State could argue that flooding UK markets with cheap chlorinated chicken from the USA is in the public interest, or that cheap aluminium wheels from China would lower the cost of cars and therefore also be in the public interest. This amendment would reverse the burden of proof, strengthening the TRA and forcing the Secretary of State to produce overwhelming evidence if he decides to ignore state-sponsored dumping and the trade-distorting impact it has. Mr. Speaker, the government is in a state of panic, chaos and capitulation, and that's why the Chancellor in the 11th hour has chosen to table a flurry of amendments. Well, it's a little bit too little, too late. As for parliamentary oversight in relation to New Clause 13, Mr. Speaker, this bill reflects yet another encroachment on parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary scrutiny, which seeks to rob this House of its right to scrutinise the UK's future trade and customs. While the Trade Secretary, not this House, would have the final say over whether the UK adopts remedies to protect key industries. While the government seeks to sidestep the House, the opposition's new Clause 13 would empower it. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we have reached crossroads in the Brexit negotiations, and this dysfunctional and divided government cannot continue as it has done and ignore the blindingly obviously, namely that a new customs union is the only way to ensure frictionless trade and access to the single market. I say this to them, Mr. Speaker, if they can't get a grip, get out.
I call the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Mel Stride, but as I do so, I must advise the House that the Right Honourable Gentleman is accompanied tonight on his 13th wedding anniversary by his good wife Michelle and indeed by their daughters Ophelia and Evelyn. It is an unusual way to spend the evening, but we hope they're enjoying it and we look forward to hearing the Right Honourable Gentleman. The Financial Secretary, Mel Stride.
Mr. Speaker, that is quite an introduction. Thank you most graciously for your lovely comments. You will no doubt be injecting some zip into my marriage as you speak. But, Mr. Speaker, the government has been clear that when we leave the European Union, we will leave the customs union. This is a matter of fact. And when considering the end state, the government will not be seeking to negotiate any form of customs union. The government's proposal will create a UK-EU free trade area which establishes a common rule book for industrial goods and agricultural products. This will maintain common high standards in these areas, but also ensure that no new changes in the future take place without the approval of Parliament. As a result of this, Mr. Speaker, we will avoid friction at the borders, protect jobs and livelihoods, as well as meeting our commitments to Northern Ireland. And we are proposing a new business-friendly customs model with the freedom to strike new trade deals around the world, a facilitated customs arrangement. And I give way to the honourable gentleman.
That should have been in. Happy birthday, and he was indeed my former economics tutorial partner at university. But could I ask the right honourable gentleman, my old friend, why are services less important than goods?
Services are most certainly not less important than goods. They make up about 80% of the economy, and we will retain greater freedoms in terms of being able to do deals around the world in that respect. But under this approach, Mr. Speaker, the UK would apply its own tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the United Kingdom, and the UK's tariffs and trade policy for goods intended for the EU. This option meets the UK's strategic objectives for our future customs relationship with the EU, and I give way to my right.
My friend, I congratulate him on his wedding anniversary. He already mentioned the facilitated customs arrangement, which is the point of the White Paper. And in describing that, in the White Paper, paragraph 17, it says this: however, the UK is not proposing that the EU applies the UK's tariffs and trade policy at its border for goods sent to the UK. I've got the wrong custom. It also says that we're not expecting it to be replicated in Europe. That new clause 36 directly contradicts that. Now, I gather there are legalisms which the people who advised on the White Paper no doubt did not consider when we put in the reference to reciprocity. Now he's going to give us legalisms as to why it doesn't matter we take reciprocity. The political point of these amendments is to destroy the White Paper and the arrangements that it proposes. And if he accepts it, they will come back for more. Why doesn't he vote against them and leave them in a tiny minority in the House of Commons, which they actually represent?
My right honourable friend for that intervention. I have very little time, and I will come to his point. And the main point is that one has to read 17A of the White Paper in its entirety in order to grasp its full meaning, rather than to take one particular part of it. But, Mr. Speaker, I will now address the amendments before us today. New Clause 1 and Consequential Amendment 2, as spoken to initially by my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, would establish a negotiating objective for the UK to maintain its participation in the EU Customs Union and make the commencement of Parts 1 and 2 of the bill conditional upon the outcome of those negotiations. Mr. Speaker, I've already set out that the UK leaving the EU Customs Union is a straightforward legal consequence of leaving the EU, and so the government must reject these amendments as well as Amendment 1. And the same applies, Mr. Speaker, to other amendments before us today, new clauses 1, 3, 4, 11, 12, and their various consequential amendments, as well as Amendments 8, 9, 12 and 14. But that does not mean, Mr. Speaker, that we will not seek to enter into a business-friendly and pragmatic arrangement that maintains trade that is as frictionless as possible between the UK and the EU 27 as part of our future partnership with the EU. This is because this government fully recognise, as was set out so eloquently by my right honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, in her comments, the vital importance of the EU as a trading partner that in turn supports the economy, jobs and prosperity throughout the United Kingdom. Mr. Speaker, let me now turn to new clause 36 in the name of my right honourable friend, the member for Whittam, which would prevent the implementation of a new arrangement that would see HMRC accounting for duty collected by HMRC to the government of another territory country unless the arrangement was reciprocal. Mr. Speaker, the government has been clear in its white paper that under its proposed facilitated customs arrangement, the UK and the EU would agree a mechanism for the remittance of relevant tariff revenue. And the UK proposes a reciprocal tariff revenue formula taking account of goods destined for the UK entering via the EU and for goods destined for the EU entering via the UK. Indeed, the White Paper itself says, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, the UK and the EU should agree a mechanism for the remittance of relevant tariff revenue. On the basis that this is likely to be the most robust approach, the UK proposes a tariff revenue formula taking account of goods destined for the UK entering via the EU and goods destined for the EU entering via the United Kingdom. So, Mr. Speaker, new clause 36 is consistent with the Chequers proposal in the White Paper, and so the government is content to accept it. Mr. Speaker, Amendment 72. I won't give way. I have a lot to cover, and I will not give way. Mr. Speaker, Amendment 72, in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Harwich and North Essex, seeks to ensure that Clause 31 cannot be used to form a customs union between the UK and the EU without primary legislation. As I've set out, the government has been clear that as we leave the European Union, we will also leave the EU's customs union. and so the government has no objection to this enhanced level of parliamentary security. I will take one intervention with 4 minutes remaining, if it is brief.
He will be aware that there is some concern on this side of the House regarding New Clause 36. He has set out why he is prepared to accept it. Could he reaffirm, for those of us who have those concerns all over the House, that this will not impact on the negotiating strategy of the UK government?
The negotiating strategy of the UK government is to seek reciprocity in this respect and in this regard, and that is set out very clearly in the White Paper. And importantly, Amendment 72 does not interfere with this purpose. Mr. Speaker, the government has no objection to the principle behind Amendment 72, and therefore we accept it. Mr. Speaker, turning now to Amendment 73 in the name of my honourable friend, the member for South Thanet. This amendment will remove a specific power that would enable HMRC to make regulations covering the application of VAT to goods in circumstances where we reach a customs union agreement with other customs union or territories under Clause 31. The Chequers Agreement does not propose such an arrangement with the European Union as part of the future economic partnership, and so the government accepts this amendment. Mr. Speaker, the effect of New Clause 37 in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Tewkesbury, would be to ensure that Northern Ireland will not form part of a separate customs territory to Great Britain. This clause is a straightforward statement of government policy. It ensures that the government will not act in a manner incompatible with the commitments made in the joint report of December last year, where it committed to protect the constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom, as well as to turn the joint report commitments into legally binding form, and the government also accepts this new clause. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the issue of our future VAT arrangements with the EU. New Clause 2 seeks to establish a negotiating objective to maintain the UK's participation in the EU VAT area. This amendment would limit our ability to appropriately consider our future VAT policy, and for this reason, Mr. Speaker, we reject it. Mr. Speaker, the government is also making an amendment to a schedule of the Finance Act 2008. Amendment 83 is consequential on the new customs framework provided for in the bill and is necessary to ensure certain excise penalties remain in place on EU exit. Mr. Speaker, I now wish to turn briefly to the powers in the bill. It is critical that we have these powers to allow us to respond flexibly going forward, but we do accept that in some cases it may be considered proportionate to apply the made affirmative procedure, and I'm grateful for the discussion that I have had with my honourable friend, the member for Edinburgh, in this regard, and it is on this basis that the government has brought forward Amendments 75, 76, 79, 81 and 23, which apply the made affirmative procedure to the powers under clauses 30, 42 and 47, the powers to make general provision in relation to import duty and that deal with retained EU VAT and excise law. Mr. Speaker, Clause 25 permits disclosures for customs duty purposes and makes clear that disclosures that would contravene the Data Protection Act 1998 are not permitted. We accept SNP Amendments 33 and 34, seeking clarity in that regard. Mr. Speaker, in my final summing up, may I say that we have had a full, robust and comprehensive debate today, as is entirely appropriate for a bill of this importance to our ability to continue after our departure from the EU as one of the world's great trading nations, importance to our ability to accommodate our future customs arrangement within our future economic partnership with the EU. Thank you.
One sentence, Senator Soubry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, clauses 36 and 73 are not designed to help this white paper. They're designed to wreck it. I'm going to try and help the white paper, and that's why I seek leave to withdraw.
Thank you. And is it the House's pleasure that New Clause 1 be withdrawn? Aye. New Clause 1 by leave withdrawn. Order. Under the order of the House of the 8th of January, I must now put the questions necessary to bring to a conclusion proceedings on consideration. We begin with New Clause 11 in the name of Her Majesty's official opposition to be moved formally. Thank you. The question is that New Clause 11 be added to the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Everyone clear the lobby.